We are live now. Good to go.
Okay. Can someone confirm whether my slides are visible? Prashantji?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I
They
can.
are.
But we can see the presenter view as well. I mean, Dr. Dhiren. Yeah.
This is better.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Dhiren, you need to convert it into slideshow mode. It is not in slideshow mode yet.
Okay.
Yes. Now it is perfect.
All right.
Now it is
Yes.
perfect. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. It's visible, na?
No.
Yes,
again,
yes, it's
it has
visible.
gone. It
Once
has
again
gone
gone
back
into presenter view.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Now it's perfect.
Yes.
Yes.
Now fine.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good evening to all. Now we know that in 2004 we have seen so many calamities, like 2008 financial crisis. In 2011 we have seen Japan tsunami. In past 10-20 years we have seen so many disasters, but nothing is comparable to current pandemic that we are facing. If we look at the scale of this pandemic, till date, we have lost so many lives. 2.8 million people has already been died. And we are already on the second wave of COVID. But the one profession, if we talk about, which has sacrificed a lot, then it would be healthcare workers. Whenever we talk about healthcare workers, they were always ready with their stethoscope, with their ventilators as a warriors to fight the COVID war. And they are the also ones who lost many lives, who lost their loved ones, family members. And that's why it is rightly mentioned that they are the real guardian of the galaxy. They are the real warriors. So today I would like to salute and appreciate all the healthcare workers for joining this program. We know that COVID has distanced us. We are not hugging each other anymore. We are distanced from our friends, relatives, and we are not hugging even people who need hug. Many members, they have lost their family members. They have lost their loved ones. And when we ask the question, why the COVID patient die, we used to wonder. But if we look at the data, now we realize that we have the answer. And if we look at the data carefully, we know it is a cardiometabolic disorders, disease like obesity, hypertension, diabetes, heart failure are the ones because of which the COVID patient die. And it is said that 60% of the COVID hospitalization can be prevented if we treat and prevent these conditions. If we look at the cardiometabolic disorder per se, apart from COVID itself, they are the #1 cause of death worldwide. In 2019, 18.6 million people have died because of the cardiometabolic disorders. 1 out of every 3 deaths on this planet is because of cardiometabolic disorders. And now it has been proven that because of the COVID, there is excess of cardiovascular death. And the problem is that many of these deaths are unreported. Many of the times, patients don't seek hospitalization because of the lockdown or other restriction or fear of hospitals. So now what we are facing is a double whammy. Double whammy in terms of COVID and cardiometabolic disorders. And it to understand between the interplay between the cardiometabolic disorder and COVID, if we want to get out of this fire in terms of cardiometabolic disorder and COVID. And that's why each year we come up with something special in form of Crossconnect. This year also, we have prepared a succinct and invigorating scientific program which will help us to understand the intricacies between the cardiometabolic disorders and COVID. And with bottom of my heart, I would like to welcome all the healthcare worker, or should I say, the guardian of the earth, to the Crossconnect 2021. And it's my honor and privilege to welcome you and invite the course director of this program, the creators of this program, Dr. Sumitra Ray from the city of Joy, Kolkata, who is a renowned cardiologist, and Dr. V. Mohan, Padma Shri, and Dr. B.C. Roy awardee, who is the pioneer in the diabetes management in India from Chennai. Welcome, Dr. Sumitra Ray and Dr. V. Mohan. Today we have a beautiful program lined up. We have talk on diabetes, dyslipidemia, hypertension, COVID, and amalgamation of all the things. So please be ready with a pen and paper and all the questions that you want to ask from our expert today. So today we have with us four eminent experts: Dr. V. Mohan, Dr. Sumitra Ray, as well as Dr. William Cushman, who is an expert on hypertension, and Dr. K.K. Agarwal, expert on COVID vaccination. So without further ado, let's start the program. And for that, for the first talk, I would like to invite Dr. V. Mohan on the stage. Now, I think virtual stage. Dr. V. Mohan don't need any introduction. For the sake of introduction, for the formal introduction, I would say a few lines about Dr. V. Mohan. Dr. V. Mohan is the chairman of Dr. Mohan's Diabetes Specialty Center, and he is the president of Madras Diabetic Research Foundation. His research interests include epidemiology of diabetes and complication, genomics of diabetes, fibrocalculous pancreatic disease, and newer concept and precision medication in diabetes. He has been conferred with the fellowship from all the 4 Royal College of Physicians. He has received enormous more than 180 awards, including prestigious Dr. B.C. Roy National Award, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar Centenary Award by ICMR, and Dr. Atkins Award, Rifkin Award from the ADA. Not only that, he has published more than 1,350 papers in peer-reviewed journal. He has a citation of more than 138,000 and H-index of 138. He has received Padma Shri from the Government of India in 2012. And recently he has published his biography, Making Excellence a Habit, The Secret to Building a World-Class Healthcare System in India, which is published by the Penguins India, and it is currently the bestseller on Amazon India. We would love to hear more about the book as well from the Dr. Mohan, but let's begin with his presentation. So now I invite Dr. V. Mohan on the podium. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Let me get my slides. Slides are visible, Dhiren?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Dhiren Pranami and INTAS for inviting me for this e-Crossconnect. And it has been my pleasure to participate with you in earlier programs as well. And this time, of course, it's a star-studded program, and you can see, and I'm very delighted to be the co-host of this along with Dr. Soumitra Ray. And we are honored that Dr. William Cushman is also here with us along with Dr. K.K. Agarwal. So I'm going to talk on a topic which I think is very important from the Indian context and all that you mentioned earlier. We talked about diabetes being a comorbid condition and how people with COVID succumb to it. Not only that, diabetes itself, it is true that the lifespan of people with diabetes is cut short by several years, both people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And therefore, to even think of a person with diabetes, that too in a country like India, living up to 100 years, might sound like it's only a hype. and it's not a reality at all. But I do believe that it is possible if we follow the ABCD mantra, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So this will be the agenda of my talk. I'll talk about the current life expectancy of people with diabetes in India. I'll discuss whether long-term survival of diabetes is possible, and then end with some mantras as to how one can achieve this. So let's talk about the life expectancy of people with diabetes. There are several reports from across the world. This is a 2010 report from the United Kingdom, which said that in type 2 diabetes, life expectancy can be reduced by up to 10 years, and in those with type 1 diabetes by even up to 20 years. Now that's quite shocking, especially in the year of the 100th year of discovery of insulin. It's very sobering that 20 years of your life are still lost in people with type 1 diabetes. In 2012, a Canadian study found that about 6 years in females and 5 years in males is cut short due to diabetes. There is some Indian data, mostly it comes from our own group, and 2 epidemiological studies. This was a relatively small study, the Chennai urban population study, where we reported on a follow-up of individuals from this. This is our first epidemiological study that we did. And what we showed in this study was that mortality rates in people with diabetes were twofold higher compared to the non-diabetic individuals. But this is a small study. In the whole of the CUP study, we had only 1,350 people, but this was the first mortality study actually reported from India on diabetes. Then we took up this very large study called as the CURE study, the Chennai Urban Rural Epidemiological Study. This study had 21,000 people in it, and this is representative of the whole of Chennai. Very productive study, about 150 papers. This is 150th paper actually from this particular study. And what we did was, after completing all the baseline studies on this, we then followed up these individuals longitudinally, and we were able to get 10-year follow-up data on them. And this is a paper we published in PLOS One in 2018, where we again reported on mortality in people with and without diabetes from this population-based study in Chennai. As I said, this is a representative study, representative of Chennai's 5 to 6 million people. And what we showed in this study was that there was still excess mortality due to diabetes, but this was more in younger individuals. So if somebody got diabetes when they are older, then the differences between diabetes and people without diabetes did not come out. And most of this was accounted by renal disease. Most recently, and I'm not showing you that data, most recently from the PURE study, which involved 21 countries and 134,000 people, followed up for 15 years. We published, my daughter actually was the first author. In fact, she was the first author of this paper also, Anjana. So she was the first author of that paper, Dr. Salim Yusuf. We published, again, to look at the mortality rates in people with diabetes, without diabetes. This time, this was only in Chennai, this paper, the PLOS One paper. But the other one in diabetes care, what we showed was that we reported on the high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. And lo and behold, what we found was that this gap between the excess mortality in people with diabetes and without diabetes had narrowed considerably in the high-income countries. And in the middle-income countries, there was a little bit of gap, but still there was a huge gap as far as the low-income countries, in which India, of course, was one of the countries, and we are one of the collaborators there as well. So these findings, which are showing you now, has now been replicated in this large international study, again followed up for 10 to 15 years. And most of it had to do with treatment, because in the low-income countries, people are not treated optimally. And that, I think, is the underlying theme, the overarching theme of the rest of my talk, that if you really close those gaps, just as it happened in the high-income countries, we'll be able to improve the longevity of people with diabetes, even in the low-income countries. And I hope to be able to convince you about that. Now, what is the current life expectancy in India? Now, this is data which shows you that in 2016, in males, the life expectancy in India is 67 years, and in females, 69 years. Every 2 or 3 years, 1 year or so gets added up. So if you see the current figures in 2020, it's probably about 69 years in males and about 70 years in females. Compare this with China, where the median survival is 76 years, and the United States is almost 79 years. So it is considerably lower in India. And this, we're not talking about people with diabetes, we're talking about all Indians. So across the board, we have a higher mortality and a lower life expectancy compared to China or the United States or many other European countries, for example. Now, this is the population pyramid of India 2019. The reason I'm showing you this is that India, you can see, is still a very relatively young population. And if you draw the line somewhere here, you will find, and this is just 25 years old, you will find how much of the population is still very young. And we have a large number of children in our population even now. Whereas if you take China, the whole pyramid will be completely changed, and they have a lot of old people. We still don't have, because our life expectancy is so short. If you go to say 65 years and above, you can see that's all the number of people, that's the percentage of people in the population in the year 2019. Only 1.3% are in the above 65 to 69 years. And as you go up, it reduces. And the line I've drawn here is 90 years. And the reason I'm showing you this is for a particular purpose. I'll come back to that. There's only 0.001% of the population which is 90 years or above in India. Now, given India's 1.3 billion population, that still works out to 1.3 million people in India. Even at 0.001%, it's still 1.3 million people. For Indians, we call it in lakhs. So it's 13 lakh people who are above totally in India. Diabetic, non-diabetic, all put together, there are only 13 lakh people in India, 1.3 million people out of the 1.3 billion who are above 90 years of age and alive. So with this, if you kind of make a rough layman's calculation, you say, well, the lifespan of India is 67 years for males, 69 years for females. Diabetes at least reduces the frequency, the life expectancy by 7 years. So what would you expect? That above 60 years of age, it should be rare to see people with diabetes living in India, isn't it? That's common sense that 7 years is going to wipe out. Then the life expectancy of people with diabetes in India should be 60 years, and very rarely will you see people above 60 years of age. So that brings us to the question, is long-term survival of diabetes possible? Some years ago, we were looking at our records. We have very large electronic records, as you may know. We have in excess of 500,000 registered diabetic patients. That's 500,000 diabetic patients across our 50 centers in 32 cities of India, all linked electronically. And now we have data going up to 30 years follow-up in them. So when we're looking through these records, we found a significant number of people who had crossed 60, 40, 50 years of diabetes, not age, 40, 50 years of diabetes with type 2 diabetes. And how that's possible is because type 2 diabetes occurs at a much younger age in our population. In the West, you get type 2 diabetes in a 50, 60 years old. So to get 40, 50, 60 years survival of type 2 diabetes is not very common in the West. I've talked to many colleagues across the world, and they very rarely see very long-term survival in type 2 diabetes. Since we get it at a much younger age, we were able to pick up these people. And so, so the question is it possible to get long-term survival? And I would put it to you, based on the studies that we published now, I would say if the ABCD mantra is followed, it is possible. So what is the ABCD mantra? A stands for A1C, which should be below 7%. B stands for blood pressure, which should be less than 140 by 90 millimeters of mercury. C stands for LDL cholesterol, and cholesterol, which should be within normal limits. We define it as 100 or 70, depending on the condition and the risk. And D, I've just bundled in discipline, which includes some form of diet, healthy eating, exercise, regular exercise, no smoking or tobacco, moderation alcohol use, and some stress reduction. Although for the last, we don't have too much of evidence, but we have just put these in because these are healthy or healthful habits, if you like to call it that way. So let us see whether we are meeting these goals today. Where do we stand in India, and are we meeting these goals? So this is a study, the ICMR India Diabetes Study, which I'm sure people in India would have heard about. This is the largest national study, which is being coordinated by our group in Chennai. Again, my daughter is the principal, the co-principal investigator running this whole study across the country. It has sample size of 124,000 people, truly representative of India's 1.3 billion people. It's a brilliantly done study, and we have now just kind of completed the study. And so in this study, we reported on the glycemic control in people with diabetes, with self-reported diabetes in urban and rural India. And the results are shown here. In green is the urban India, and in orange is rural India. So what we want is A1C below 7%. And if you look at that, we defined as good control. So if you look at those good control in India, urban and rural, less than 1/3 have their A1C under control. And this is a representative sample of the whole country, as I said. If you look at fair control between 7 to 9%, those are the figures. And let's look at the poor control that is defined as A1C above 9%. Then you have 32% of people in urban areas and close to 40% of people in rural areas who have A1C above 9%. So it's very clear that the sugar control, diabetes control is not optimal in India. So as far as the A is concerned, we are nowhere near. We've got a lot of work to do. Now, this is a more recent paper published in Diabetic Medicine. And in this paper, this comes from the CAR study, the Center for Cardiometabolic Risk and Reduction in South Asia. This is funded by the NIH. And this is a study done in collaboration with Dr. Venkat Narayan and colleagues from the University of Emory in Atlanta. And the study is done in Chennai, again, a representative sample of Chennai, in New Delhi, again, a representative sample, and in the city of Karachi in Pakistan. So we have 3 cities from South Asia in this. And the idea was to see exactly this, the A, B, C, D itself. How many of them have achieved A1C, the figures I just mentioned, the B and the C. And for D, we only took smoking. They should not be smokers, okay? So how many of them had, among the people with diabetes in these 3 cities, how many had the A, B, C, and D achieved? And we found that only 7% of all those who had declared themselves to have diabetes had this A, B, C, D under control. So 93% had either the sugars out of control or BP not under control or LDL not under control, or they were smoking. So this is really bad. And it means in countries like Japan, for example, it's almost 50% of everybody with diabetes who has the A, B, C, D under control. So you've got a long way to go as far as India is concerned. So finally, the million-dollar question comes, is there proof that people can live long and healthy lives despite diabetes if all this is done? So that's a question which very often people ask me. You talk about the ABCD. That is assume that they did it, the ABCD. Then do you have proof that they can? I just mentioned the PURE study. I didn't show you the result, but the PURE study published about 4 or 5 months ago, where we found that in the high-income countries, the HIC countries, they were able to bring down the mortality in people with diabetes. And in fact, if I can give you another statistic, people without diabetes in the low-income countries do worse than the people with the diabetes in the high-income countries. If you look at the mortality rate, the cardiovascular mortality, the all-cause mortality in people with and without diabetes, in the low-income countries like India, the people without diabetes are doing worse than the people with diabetes. So they have gone to that extent by following the ABCD mantra. Okay. Now, this is a paper which we published in 2013 in Diabetes Care. And it was for this paper, I believe, that the Harold Rifkin Award was given to me. So this is a paper where we reported for the first time, I think it's the only paper till now, on 40-year survival in people with type 2 diabetes. So the title of the paper is Clinical Profile of Long-Term Survivors and Non-Survivors with Type 2 Diabetes. And we had 238 patients who had completed 43 years duration. Let me get the laser pointer. So you can see that the mean duration of diabetes was 43.7 plus minus 4 years. So many had completed 50 years. Now I have many who have completed 60 years of diabetes and they're still doing well. So when this report came out, we were able to show that long-term survival is indeed possible in these people. And what did they do? What we found was that these long-term survivors had better glycemic control, blood pressure control, and lipid control. So back to the A, B, C. So there's no big mantra involved in this. If you achieve what you're supposed to achieve as a physician, get the sugars under control, get the BP under control, get the lipids under control, you are going to get long-term survival. And this is a paper which actually proves it. And you can see the results here, that if you look at, this is HbA1c. So you look at those, the white is the survivors, and this is the non-survivors. You can see how many of them had A1c, which is very good. And go to the other end of the spectrum, very poor control, you can see that the non-survivors had very poor control. I think there's one for LDL as well, yeah. So if you look at the LDL cholesterol, you can see that much better LDL control in the survivors compared to the non-survivors who had very poor LDL control. And the same thing for blood pressure as well. Now, we went a step further and last year published yet another paper where we looked at, now that one was only in relation to the years of diabetes, the duration of diabetes, 40 years, 50 years survival. Now, the question comes, we are talking about age of the patient. So can people with diabetes really live beyond 90 years of age? And that's the reason I told you earlier in that pyramid that only 0.001% of people in India actually live beyond 90 years. So I was quite excited when I got this group of people together who were above 90 years of age, who had already completed 20, 30, 40 years of diabetes and were still alive to tell the story. And this was compared with a group of people who were between 50 to 60 years. And we compared them and we saw what is the difference between the two. It's a very interesting paper. I think, again, there are very few papers which have compared 90-year-old type 2s with the younger ones. And what we found here was that, and this is just a study to show, then what treatment did they take? So very often people ask me, so did they have all the SGLT2s? Did they have DPP4s? Did they have all the best treatment? 50, 60 years ago, when these people started treatment, these drugs were simply not available. The only drugs which were available were sulfonylureas and metformin. So you can see, and again, people say, if you give sulfonylureas, oh, they will die. These are 90-year-old people, 65% of them are on sulfonylureas, and they're doing well. Of course, it is a modern sulfonylureas, glycoside or glimepiride. And of course, some were on metformin. And you can see only about 2% of people were actually taking the DPP4 inhibitor. So it is not due to very expensive medicines that they were taking, even using the low-cost generic drugs. These people, and these are not, diet-treated people. Only 3% of them were on diet alone. All of them were on medication. So it is due to better diabetes control and the ABC being maintained that they were able to live so long. And just to show you a group of these people who lived here, that's my daughter and that's me. And this is this group of people who were above 90 years of age. Some of them, like this gentleman here, was a vice chancellor of 2 universities. When he came for this picture, he was 99 years old. You can see he's winning at 90. So we had only honored people, a large group of people we brought in, and then honored them by giving them a medal and a certificate and so on, and honoring them for conquering their diabetes. And to our knowledge, type 2 diabetes people being honored about 90 years of age, there's not too many that I know of. And they're all maintaining very good health. Some of them have now crossed 100 years of age. This man did cross 100. This man is 99 now. And there are a few others who are, 1 or 2 others who are not in this picture have also crossed 100 years. So we are now able to see people who are crossing not only 90 years, but also 100 years of age. And these are people who have had diabetes for very, very long periods of time. And therefore, what did I learn from these people? I'm going to end with that these are the mantras that I learned from these people. If one has to live up to 100 years of age with diabetes, first of all, you detect diabetes early. The tragedy with type 2 diabetes is that it's a silent disease and you can miss the diagnosis for 10 to 15 or more years. And that you're not going to get back. And that early period of good glycemic control, what we call as a good metabolic memory, stands them in good stead to prevent the complications. The ABCD mantra we already talked about. The next one is that the first 10 years are very important. So if you miss the first 10 years, either by not knowing or because you don't control them properly, then it's very difficult to prevent complications because the seeds for complications are already sown. Then exercising regularly is something which they all did. They all went for a walk. None of them were big athletes, but they went for the regular walk. And most of them ate reasonably healthy diets. Not that they never ate a sweet or anything like that, but they were reasonably careful. And of course, many of them did yoga and pranayama, breathing and so on. And most importantly, all of them were coming for regular follow-up. We have published separate papers to show how regularity of follow-up is very important. If you don't come regularly for follow-up, you're not able to keep those graphs under control, the 7% BP and so on. It keeps going up, up, up. After 3-4 years, there is clinical inertia, then we lose, then it's a losing battle. Whereas those who came regularly, all of them came regularly for follow-up. That was very striking in their records, 3 to 4 times a year. So I would like to conclude by saying that if one follows these mantras, even people with diabetes can live up to 100 years of life. And I'm going to end with this quote. As many of you know, my father was one of the first diabetologists of India. He set up the first diabetic clinic at Chennai in the year 1948. And when I joined him as a first-year medical student and started working with him when I was 18 years old, this is one of the first things he told me. He said, a well-disciplined and controlled person with diabetes is often better and healthier than one without diabetes. And being a teenager, I used to argue with him and say, this is what you would say. I mean, you're a diabetologist and you have to, give all this hype to people so that they believe you. Where diabetes is cutting short people's lives. And what are you saying? That they are better and healthier than one without diabetes. And he used to say, no, they come for regular follow-up. So they look after not just their diabetes, they're following their diet. We advise them not to smoke. They're walking every day and they're controlling their blood pressure, they're controlling everything else. So, but he didn't live to see that this 100 years and all that's possible. This was his belief. But today, with the proof that we have, I think that he was right, that a well-disciplined, controlled person with diabetes is often better and healthier than one without diabetes. And I've seen a lot of healthy people today in their 90s, and their number is increasing, and they're doing extremely well. So I'd like to stop there by saying that it's not a hype. It is a reality, but we all have a lot of work to do. Remember that 7%, that miserable figure of 7%, where the ABCD is maintained. If we all work towards that ABCD mantra, and I know we have on the B also, we have today in the symposium, on the C, cholesterol, lipids also we have. So all of these we'll be covering in today's symposium, and I would like to just stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan, for that excellent review. With the 3 generations of now, you are having the progressing the diabetic management in India. Congratulations on that. And congratulations to your daughter as well, who is doing so well in your line. Now you have given very nicely that it is a comprehensive approach which is important. A diabetologist cannot be myopic just to control the sugar. A cardiologist cannot be myopic just to control the blood pressure. So all of us need to be comprehensive, wholesome physician. That is the message to all the attendees over here, that even in the days of super specialty, we must not look beyond, we must look beyond our specialty and see the others as well. Now, may I ask you, with all these things under your purview, how do you propose to promote this education to the public as well as to the physicians of India? Because you have proved now that ABCD mantra, if we can follow, we can really look for a better and longer life. But how to do that?
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I think it's a very valid question, because in a large country, if it's a small country of a couple of million people or 5 million people like Denmark or somewhere, it's much easier, or a country like Mauritius, 1 million people. That's like a part of my city, so if things like that, it's much easier. But we're talking about a country which is 1.3 billion. And not only that, spread across such a big geography, and beyond that, even more, languages being 23 official languages and thousands of dialects, and every 100 kilometers you go in India and everything changes. It's not easy. So I think that's where collaboration comes in, and we have to work at different levels: physician level, specialist level, nurses level, at the primary health center, secondary, tertiary levels. All these we have to do a massive education program. So we have taken it in different ways. One is through fellowship programs. The second is through diabetes educator programs, nurse educator programs, and then with the Public Health Foundation of India, large number of physicians being trained through the CCEBDM courses, training government doctors. So through that it goes. But I think more important than all that is the social social media. Today, I think social media is how you reach, and all that I've been talking now, A, B, C, D, and all these, we have been making videos and making them, and they're quite popular. Some of them have been seen by millions of people. So I think that's one way through which, and see, one of the problems in India is that there's a lot of quackery going on, including, I hate to say it, but some in our own specialty who keep saying that there is nothing called diabetes, allow the sugars to be as high as possible. Blood pressure is a normal thing. 180 by 120 is a normal blood pressure. That is what nature wanted you. Otherwise, your blood pressure won't be like that. There's nothing called cholesterol. So all statins should be stopped. This kind of thing is being done. Quackery is being done by, including some cardiologists and so on in our country, and physicians. Apart from the traditional medicine people who also keep talking all this. And then the other thing, that if you take medicines, you will get kidney problem. If you take medicines, you will get this, and you take medicines, you'll get cancer. So these kind of fears are constantly there. So I think people who practice scientific medicine should also put the other side of the coin also, and say why it is necessary to have follow-up. See, when you ask people to come for follow-up, they think because we want their money, we are asking them to come. If you go there, he'll make more money. That's why he's asking you to come. It's not that at all. If you just compare a person who's coming regularly follow-up and not coming regularly follow-up, the complication rate is so much higher, and they'll end up, being penny wise and pound foolish, because they'll develop kidney disease and so on, which is so expensive. Treatment of diabetes is not costly. Not treating diabetes is costly. Treating blood pressure is not costly. Not treating blood pressure is costly, because the complications come. These are not easy to get into the public, but I think repeatedly, if you keep saying it, and in every forum we emphasize it, especially in the social media, eventually the message will spread.
Thank you, Dr. Mohan. That is very, very interesting. But due to lack of time, one announcement is that for all the delegates, you can actually type your question even during the talk, so that we can take it up at the end of the talk. But there is not much of time on this session. This half an hour is over. And just to end it, Dr. Mohan, I think you have given 3 targets of sugar, cholesterol, and pressure. But unfortunately, the targets are also shifting. When you say 140 by 80, now it is 130 by 70, as Dr. Cushman will elaborate. I will elaborate how the LDL target is shifting. So our job is getting...
I've been very liberal with all. I've given 7, not 6.5, because at least that, if you're even that, only 7% have achieved.
Exactly.
So,
exactly. Yeah. That's what I want to say also for the physicians. Don't be too fussy about the targets, because as you said, 40 years ago, there is only sulfonylurea. The target was 140 by 90 for blood pressure. And so people are living with that. So at least achieve that as a step 1. But if you want to... Yeah, exactly. So big thanks. Please stay with us, because you will moderate my session. Back to Dr. Pranami, and to all the delegates, please type your responses, your comments, and your questions even during the talk, so that we can take it up at the end.
Thank you so much, sir. And now it's time for another interesting session. And for that, I would like to invite Dr. Sumitra Ray on the virtual podium. And I would like to formally introduce Dr. Sumitra Ray. Dr. Sumitra Ray is the Director of Invasive Cardiology, Emory Hospital, Kolkata. He's a professor of Vivekananda Institute of Medical Sciences. He's an executive committee member and ex-vice president of the CSI, Cardiology Society of India. He has numerous accolades. He stood first in all his education career at higher secondary level, MBBS, MD. He has pursued his MRCP in UK after completing MD from Kolkata Medical College and got FRCB. He is trained in cardiology at Royal London Hospital, London. He has published numerous papers, review articles, and chapters in cardiology books in India and abroad. He is on the editorial board of Indian Heart Journal and International Journal of Diabetic and Dyslipidemia. He has represented CSI in international conferences, and he is the founder president of Kolkata Cardiology Foundation. A charming personality and a great human being. I would invite now Dr. Sumitra Ray on the virtual podium for his talk on the dyslipidemia.
Thank you, Dr. Dhiren, and thank you to all my co-faculty and the delegates over here and the INTES people for giving me the opportunity. Now, can you see my slide?
Yes.
So where Dr. Mohan ended, I'll start over there. My talk is the ever-evolving treatment landscape of lipid-lowering therapies. Now, my disclosure is that I haven't taken any kind of help from anybody to prepare this. My agenda will include the evolving, as the term is evolving. So evolving knowledge of lipid particles, evolving evidence of association of lipid with cardiovascular disease, evolving agents to treat dyslipidemia, and lastly, evolving targets of lipid management, as I was mentioning in the last discussion. So first is evolving knowledge of lipid particle very shortly for our delegates and for ourselves, just to remind ourselves that when we are talking about cholesterol and triglycerides, they are not roaming around freely in the bloodstream. They are part of lipoprotein particles, and all lipoprotein particles, starting from chylomicron to the remnant to VLDL to IDL to LDL, LP, and HDL, all of them contain both cholesterol ester and triglyceride in the core. They have got a phospholipid lining, and interspersed was there different kind of apoproteins which actually define the character of that lipoprotein. Like apoprotein B100 means it is an LDL particle, apolipoprotein A1 means it's an HDL particle. So all particles contain both cholesterol and triglyceride to different amount, and that defines the pathogenicity or atherogenicity of that particle. If you see the three particles, LDL, IDL, and VLDL, and to some extent LPA, are the only lipoproteins which are found in the plaque at the biopsy. So these are the particles which enter through the podocytes of the endothelium into the subendothelial tissue to create the atherosclerotic gruel material. Now, coming to the evolving evidence of association of lipid with cardiovascular disease, this is a very fantastic slide I found where it is shown that not all cardiovascular risks are modifiable. Almost 40%, which is defined by the age, gender, and genetics, are largely not modifiable. What is modifiable? Of the rest 60%, 30% is modified by statin therapy. Just by statin therapy and changing the lipid parameters, you can modify the 30% risk, and all other risk called the residual risk can be clumped into the rest 30%, which can be treated as well, as Dr. Mohan was alluding to, which was nicely shown by Dr. Salim Yusuf about 17 years ago by the Interheart study, where he found that 9 modifiable risk factors can account for more than 90% of the population attributable risk of the first heart attack. And topping the chart was ApoB, as you said, at LDL cholesterol, by ApoA1, that is HDL cholesterol. That accounts for 49% of the population attributable risk, as is shown that this ratio starting from 1, if the odd ratio for first heart attack is 1 for the ratio 1, when the ratio becomes 10, the chance of first heart attack becomes 6. So 6 times more or 600% more as the line progresses. If we see the LDL cholesterol, now the ApoB part, it is the lower the LDL cholesterol, the higher the longevity, lower the mortality. And those few people who are genetically bestowed with a lower LDL cholesterol, they enjoy this extra lifespan. But we can modify this LDL by pharmacological means to improve the lifespan, as I will show how we treat the dyslipidemia. Now, this is a beautiful slide by European Society of Cardiology published in 2019 of their dyslipidemia guideline. You see that average LDL-C reduction by moderate intensity statin is 30%, by high intensity statin around 50%, by high intensity statin and ezetimibe around 65%, by PCSK9 inhibitor alone 60%, by PCSK9 inhibitor plus high intensity statin 75%, and all the three together 85%. So if you know your baseline LDL cholesterol, you know exactly what tool to employ to achieve your target LDL cholesterol. And if you know how you can achieve the target LDL cholesterol, and if you know your baseline risk, then you exactly know how much absolute risk you can reduce for your patient. This is almost like mathematics. Now, just to recapitulate, what is this statin intensity I was talking about? High intensity means atorvastatin 40 or 80 milligram or rosuvastatin 20 or 40 milligram. Though I must say that atorvastatin 80 milligram had got backup studies and rosuvastatin 20 had got backup studies. Other figures are extrapolation. Moderate intensity statins are lower doses of atorvastatin, rosuvastatin with some other statin like pravastatin, lovastatin or pitavastatin, and low intensity statin is really very low doses of simvastatin. We have got bile acid sequestrants. They are effective and safe option, can be particularly beneficial for statin intolerant patients. They are cholestyramine, cholestyramine, and cholesyvilum, and they can be prescribed either alone or in combination. But the beauty is that they can be given even in pregnant ladies and in familial hypercholesterolemia, even homozygous. Then we have in our armamentarium cholesterol absorption inhibitor, that is ezetimibe. By IMPROVE trial, it has been shown by simvastatin with or without ezetimibe in high-risk patient, if we can reduce the LDL cholesterol from the median of 70 to 53, we can achieve an absolute risk reduction of 2%, which is very significant in p-values on 7 years of follow-up, with number needed to treat is only 50. Then we come to the newer molecule, that is PCSK9 inhibitor, that is the trigger for the evolution. And the proven foundation is that if you see the fundamental difference of statin and PCSK9, they both increase the LDL receptor on the hepatocyte, but PCSK9 molecules are stimulated by statin, and so there is competition with LDL to take up the receptor post, the receptor site. So LDL is not cleared so much. So LDL reduction from the blood is not so much. But PCSK9 inhibitor not only increases LDL receptor, but they destroy the PCSK9 molecule so that there is no competition of LDL molecule to bind to LDL receptor and get internalized and destroyed in the hepatocyte with a thumping reduction of LDL cholesterol, which has been proven by Mendelian randomization. By genetic studies, there is almost 4-fold reduction of coronary heart disease if there is some genetic modification or mutation in the PCSK9 gene. And in the Fourier trial by therapeutic intervention, you have got an astronomical p-value of reduction of 25% of relative risk. If we see the Fourier trial, all the chronic atherosclerotic patient and the primary efficacy endpoint is 3-point MES along with hospitalization and revascularization. If we can reduce the LDL cholesterol from 90 to 35, we can achieve a clear 2% absolute risk reduction of the primary efficacy endpoint over 3 years. And the Odyssey trial with alirocumab dealt with acute coronary syndrome patient as opposed to chronic atherosclerotic patients. And they found that with similar reduction of LDL cholesterol from in the tune from 90 to in the range of 40 or 45, we can again achieve exactly 2% of absolute risk reduction of the primary endpoint with a very significant p-value. So the ESC guidelines included that in high-risk patient, if we cannot achieve the LDL goal with statin alone, we have to add ezetimibe with class 1 indication. And if we cannot achieve LDL goal with statin plus ezetimibe, we have to add PCSK9 inhibitor as a class 1 recommendation. Now, emerging agents for LDL reduction is inclisiran, which is a novel siRNA therapy, which is an RNA therapy, which targets the mRNA within the hepatocyte, leading to increased number of LDL receptor. They are actually destroying the production of PCSK9 molecule in the fetus. I mean, in their fetus, in the hepatocyte, when they are being produced, they are destroyed by changing the mRNA. There's low immunogenicity and high durability. Only twice a year you have to take the injection, and they reduce LDL cholesterol by 50%, even in familial hypercholesterolemic patient. And the bempedoic acid is an inhibitor of ATP citrate lyase that works through the cholesterol synthase pathway, like statin. They're not like nothing to do with PCSK9. They are more like statin, leading to LDL reduction and reduction up to 30%. Do you have evidence? Yes, with Orion trial is a huge group of trials, at least 20 programs going on. Some have been completed, some are on ASCVD, some are on familial hypercholesterolemia, some are on special populations like Chinese, Japanese population, like hepatic renal failure population. So there is a huge ambit of inclisiran treatment, and it has been shown that with 2 injections, you can reduce inclisiran by LDL cholesterol by around 60 to 70%. But what is the proof of event reduction? Yes, last year in the ACC International Conference, they presented the data from Orion 11 that cardiovascular endpoint was reduced by 20% from 10.3 to 7.8, which is significant. Heart attack was reduced by 50% from 2.7 to 1.2, and stroke was reduced by 80% from 1% to 0.2%. So conclusion was, among a high-risk cohort with elevated LDL, despite maximally tolerated statin therapy, inclisiran treatment really achieved significant cardiovascular benefit. Very recently, only 3 weeks ago, it was published that the combination of bempedoic acid, ezetimibe, and atorvastatin in patients with hypercholesterolemia, they significantly reduced LDL cholesterol, and 90% of patients achieved the guideline-directed goal, though we do not achieve yet any clinical endpoint on this. We are waiting. For high triglyceride, ESC has given the guideline with high-risk patient, give statin first. On statin, if triglyceride is not yet controlled, we have got the very good trial by reduce it by Dr. Deepak Bhatt, that eicosapentaenoic acid 2 grams twice daily can reduce significantly the cardiovascular event. And if the LDL goal is achieved, but triglycerides still high, we can give fenofibrate, bezafibrate, or our own Indian molecule of saroglitazar. And for primary prevention also, we can use fenofibrate in certain situations. And the last 2 minutes on evolving targets of lipid management. The target has evolved long ago. We haven't took notice of it. You see, the TNT trial showed long ago, about 15 years ago, that LDL below 64 is better than LDL above 64, significantly better. Jupiter showed 10 years ago that LDL below 50 is better than LDL above 50. Even proved that LDL below 40 was better than LDL above 40. 6% extra benefit. We never looked into it because we could not achieve the LDL below 40. Now we can achieve it. We have got renewed interest in it, which has been rekindled by the Fourier trial, which showed even LDL below 20 gives you an extra 6% benefit than if your cholesterol LDL is above 20. That is, even if 25, there is still scope for reduction to below 20 to achieve further improvement. That is amazing. And actually that is taken up by ESC, saying that the very high risk group who are the ASCVD, and very interesting, not only you have to have an event, just by imaging, you can have a carotid Doppler study, you can have a CT angio and show that you have got ASCVD. That's it. And you are very high risk group. And familial hypercholesterolemia with risk factor, with CKD, with diabetes, with target organ damage. Your target is no longer 70, it is 55. And in certain cases, if you have got a second event within 2 years, your target may be as low as below 40, not even 55. And we have got some emerging targets like angiopoietin-like protein 3 and 4. Very recently, it has been shown only last year that they actually account for circulating triglyceride and ANGLP4 associated with a lower waist to hip ratio, which is so important for Indians. Improved insulin glucose metabolism, so important for Dr. Mohan, and lower risk of coronary heart disease and type 2 diabetes. Whilst the genetic mimicry of ANGLP3 was associated with an improved kidney function. So you see the spread of the knowledge and target. Now, triglyceride as a target, it's evolving. It's so fast evolving that very recently there is a renaissance of plasma triglyceride, removing HDL cholesterol from its second place after LDL. LDL still remains the first place. The second place is taken by triglyceride and not HDL anymore. But importantly, all triglyceride-rich lipoprotein carry cholesterol in addition to triglyceride, as I said in my first slide. And the cholesterol within this particle is considered to be the predominant atherogenic agent and not the triglyceride itself. Very recent 2 publications alluded to this conclusion. ApoB is becoming a popular clinical biomarker, but again, it is not very easy to measure it. Lipoprotein A is having some dwindling publicity. Sometimes it says, yes, it's a marker. Sometimes it says it should be a target. We are not talking about target because we could not reduce it. Statin, if anything, increased LPA. Now with evolocumab, alirocumab, they can reduce LPA. So we are now talking about reduction of LPA and reduction of further stroke. And my last concept is that, last 1 minute, is it's not sufficient to reduce the LDL cholesterol. You have to do it very early for longer period. So if you see this simple graph that in familial hypercholesterolemia heterozygous patient is supposed to have a cardiac event at the age of 35. If you start high-dose statin at the age of 20, you can defer this event from 35 to 48 years. But if you can start this statin at the age of 10, then you can defer this not only to 48 years, but up to 53 years. So there comes the importance of annual time averaged LDL-C per person per year. Fact is, absolute risk reduction depends on absolute reduction in LDL cholesterol and duration of that reduction, and not on the mode of reduction. Dose regime and effectiveness is, please look at this, very, very interesting. 40 milligram per deciliter reduction for LDL cholesterol. If you can maintain for 5 years, you are assured to reduce the cardiovascular risk by 22%. But if you use statin, you have to give 365 tablets per year. And this 40 milligram reduction you won't achieve, you will achieve only 23 milligram reduction because people will forget to take statin. If you give PCSK9 26 injections per year, 2 weekly injection, then you won't achieve this 40 milligram reduction, you will achieve 30 milligram reduction. But with inclisiran injections, perhaps you will have this full benefit of 40 milligram reduction of LDL cholesterol over years. And your projected benefit will be from not 30%, but 52% of life saving. And my future directions will be PCSK9 vaccination, once in lifetime, maybe an occasional boost, which is coming up, and gene editing using the CRISPR-Cas9 platform. Again, you see, interestingly, introducing loss of function mutation in the PCSK9 gene. So we are again targeting the PCSK9 molecule. So my friends, to summarize, LDL-C cholesterol is still the most important modifier or risk factor for atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, considering blood pressure, considering diabetes, considering everything. Target of LDL-C depends on the clinical condition, and we are reducing the target every day, as I was saying, which is making our life difficult and our patients' life difficult, but long life. These targets are now achievable with lifestyle management and pharmacotherapy. LDL-C value as low as 20% has been proved to be safe if can be achieved. Statin remains the foundational treatment, supplemented as required by ezetimibe, PCSK9 inhibitor, bempedoic acid, and inclisiran in near future. Newer targets for lipid parameters are evolving, including triglyceride-rich lipoprotein, LPA, angiopoietin-like proteins, etc. PCSK9 vaccination and gene editing are in evaluation. Concept of cholesterol life year. Cholesterol year is growing very fast, and we have to detect them very young at the age of 20 rather than at the age of 40 to give them the maximum benefit of our knowledge and education. Thank you very much. I give the stage to Dr. Mohan.
Thank you, Dr. Soumitra Ray. That was a fabulous talk. I can see that you have taken those values much lower than the humble 100 milligrams, which I said. Of course, I was talking on a population basis, and if you can achieve it. And of course, we know that in Indians, much lower targets are needed. 70, 50, and now we have made it even 20 as being safe. And similarly, I'm sure we're going to hear from Dr. Cushman about the BP goals as well. So let me see whether there are some questions here. So what should be the minimum level of LDL for healthy life? Is it necessary to estimate LDL, LP little a probably, LDL-A, is it? LP little a probably. When to order for ApoB estimation? So there are 3 questions. You can take those and I'll give you the next one.
Thank you. The LPA is now recommended that should be done at least once in your lifetime, and not that any time you choose. I would recommend, we are doing a South Asia Pacific recommendation as part of it, and it will come out very shortly, that as early as possible in your lifetime, you do an LPA estimation. You don't have to necessarily treat it immediately by alirocumab or evolocumab, but it will give a risk enhancer for your LDL cholesterol. Your LDL target will go down if your LPA is high. And perhaps you will try for options which can reduce LPA better than the other options which just target the LDL. Second question is that LDL cholesterol general target.
Minimal for life, they're saying, because there are people say it goes down too low. You have already answered it, saying up to 20 is okay. But they're saying, is there a minimum? Because this is all from social media where you don't have enough cholesterol,
I know.
Suicides, cancers, all kinds of things, there.
Yeah, actually, I have got, I did not show that slide, that there are lots of myths for the atherosclerotic cardiovascular event you prevent. For the thousands events you prevent, you take about 10 hepatic problem, about 20 muscle problem, about 1 cataract, about 0.1 suicide, but about 50 to 100 diabetes. Yes, that is very important. We do cause diabetes with statin therapy, but we have to take care of that. But the benefit far outweigh the risk. But at the moment, I won't say that you have to go to 20 for everybody. Don't do that. Don't do that. For high risk patient, 50 should be the target for Indian, or for reasonably high risk, 70 to 100, I would stop there. So that is my personal take. I will ask Dr. Mohan for his opinion as well on this.
I entirely agree. I mean, it's a very high risk patients. You talked about the familial, hypercholesteremia. Those are all, people don't even live beyond the 30th birthday. So there you have to really hit hard. Otherwise, they're going to die. And so then I know families where for generations, people have not crossed 30 years of age. So these are all very frightening things. So then there is another one which says, is there a potential gene therapy for reducing CAD in the horizon?
I just mentioned about the PCSK9 genes they are addressing now. By the CRISPR platform, we are actually targeting the hepatocyte gene so that the PCSK9 is not produced at all, so that LDL is taken up by the LDL receptor of hepatocyte and LDL comes down to very low levels. Yes.
I think many of the questions are repeats. If you're going down too low, isn't it necessary for inherent part of cell membrane? I think you have answered that. And of course, the other question which people frequently ask, which is a no-brainer, is at what dose to continue when the adequate level LDL is raised. I mean, if you lower the dose, it's going to go up. So it's a no-brainer. So yeah. So whatever dose you're on, I suppose you have to continue. There's one more. So many.
Unless there is a side effect, you have to continue.
Correct. That's true. So many, the last one we'll take. So many in the early 30s are coming up with LDL 180 with no apparent risk factors. Would you start statin? That also you answered, at even at age 10.
But here is one caution, Dr. Mohan. These people coming young with LDL 180, we must do the family screening.
Correct.
So that we are missing familial hypercholesterolemia heterozygous type. So these are the patients at the starting point to get a whole family who are actually suffering from hypercholesterolemia. And we should detect them proactively and treat them proactively.
And the last one is, would atorva be better than rosuva if you want to start early?
It is open to your choice, sir. I won't say. You have got equivalent dose. 40 milligram of atorvastatin is equivalent to 20 milligram rosuvastatin. There are some minor changes in terms of triglyceride, HDL, and LPA changes, but those are minor things. I mean, it's. I think it's a free choice. free choice.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I think we still have further questions coming up in the panel discussion. Since we are now running out of time, let me go on now and introduce Dr. Kushman. So it's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce Dr. W.C. William C. Kushman, who is a medical director of the Department of Preventive Medicine and professor of preventive medicine and physiology at the University of Tennessee in Memphis in Tennessee. He is author and part of several international hypertension guidelines. So he's no better person than him to talk about what blood pressure values. And I know there's been a lot of confusion, JNC 7, JNC 6, 7, and 8, and so on. I'm sure he's going to clear all that confusion. He has won several awards, including the 2005 Excellence in Leadership Award, the Consortium for Southeastern Hypertension Council, the 2010 inaugural Barnwell Award, Lifetime Achievement Awards, and many, many others. He's an investigator for some of the most path-breaking trials, including PATHS, All Hat, Accord, Examine, Rewind. His several hundreds of publications. He's received more than $60 million in research funding. And so thank you, Dr. Kushman, for joining us. And it's a great honor. He'll be talking to us on BP goals. Is there a magic number? So over to Dr. Kushman.
Yes, thank you very much. It's wonderful to be with you today and to be on this panel with some very distinguished speakers. I'm going to hopefully be able to share my screen.
Yes,
and,
it's gone. Oh, it's gone. That's it. Okay, you're done. You're all set.
So is that showing now?
No, again it's gone. It was up, but now it's showing a leader in 2020 Gartner Magic Quadrant. Try again.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm trying to find the controls and I can't find them.
Initially, the first slide was up. Your title slide was up.
Yes, but then when I put it on presentation mode.
Yes. Yeah, it's there now. Now it's fine.
You do see that? Okay.
Yes.
So I guess I won't put it on presentation mode because
it can go like this. It's good enough. It's seen.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm going to speak for a few minutes on blood pressure goals and is there a magic number? Here are my disclosures. I have no financial disclosures. Just need to say that what I'm going to say is from my perspective and opinion and not necessarily the official views of the U.S. The SPRINT trials, the NIH or the U.S. government. And this is difficult to do without building, but this is a study that was done by Rajiv Agarwal, and it actually is representative of a number of different studies, but it was extremely well done. He's in Indianapolis here in the United States. And Dr. Agarwal compared patients using just what's done routinely in clinics, in the overwhelming majority of clinics in just clinical practice, and compared that with using standard guideline recommended technique for measuring blood pressure. And I think this is a very important place to start because it really does matter how we measure blood pressure, even though we view it pretty laxly. So here he showed that this happened to be a chronic kidney disease population, but we see the same thing in a general hypertensive population. And what he found was that comparing the two methods, what's typically done in clinics and what should be done in clinics, there was about a 13 millimeter mercury difference in blood pressure. This is systolic blood pressure. So there's systolic and diastolic blood pressure differences. And so that's the average. The 95%, if you will, limits of agreement were as much as 46 millimeters mercury higher for the routine office measurement, or 20 millimeters, 21 millimeters mercury lower. So it can vary from patient to patient. And so what it points, and there are a number of other studies that really show that on average there's about a 10 to 20 millimeter mercury difference if the blood pressure is taken the way it's routinely poorly done and the way we should do it. All guidelines recommend doing it in a standard way, and it definitely is how we've done it in studies. So here is a guideline that came out just this month, the KDIGO, or the International Kidney Hypertension Guidelines, and I actually participated in this. And our first recommendation was we recommend standardized office blood pressure in preference to routine office blood pressure for the diagnosis and management of high blood pressure in adults. And it's a very strong recommendation. So, and again, really stressing this, and most recent guidelines in recent years have been putting a greater and greater stress on our proper measurement of blood pressure. So the key is proper preparations, abstinence from caffeine, exercise, and smoking for at least 30 minutes. If the patient hasn't done that properly, then, and by the way, can you—
lost the slide, Dr. Schmidt.
You lost the slide, okay.
It's kind of went off. Oh, this back. Okay. It's back now.
Sorry, I was just trying to put it right in front of me. But you can still see it now, right?
You can see it now, yeah.
Feet on the floor, arm and back supported. It's very important. It shouldn't be done on an examining table without the back supported. We actually reported that in 1990. And most importantly, the patient should keep quiet and should not be spoken to for 5 minutes before the measurements are taken and during the measurements. And ideally, multiple measurements should be taken and averaged. Or you can take a couple and just use the second one, for example. And that's the most difficult thing for most people to do in clinical practice. Next is very important, use validated equipment. I was in a clinic just a couple days ago where the nurse said she used her aneroid sphygmomanometer that she'd gotten when she trained in nursing school. And so it undoubtedly, and it's not being calibrated or checked, it undoubtedly is not accurate. And then the proper cuff size. In the United States, 50% of our patients need at least a large cuff. And then the position is very important. The arm should be at heart level and supported on a table or something like that. The advantages, why is this important? It's because that's what we have used in all large hypertension clinical trials and also in most epidemiologic studies. And it minimizes the misclassification and over or under treatment of hypertension. The disadvantages, it does take staff training and retraining, and it can take more time. Certainly, if you're doing the blood pressure manually, it's going to take more time. But with a fully automated machine, and there are a number of them on the market now where you can put the cuff on the patient, get them ready, push the button, it waits 5 minutes and takes 3 readings and averages them. And that's, for example, what we did in both the Accord and the Sprint trial and many modern studies. And so while that's going on, the staff can be going and doing something else. But the patient should not be interviewed while the blood pressures are taken. And it's not unusual for us to see even as much as 30 or 40 millimeter mercury higher blood pressure if the blood pressures are done incorrectly. And so I just want to start with that it's extremely important how we measure the blood pressure. And in deciding what the blood pressure goals are, all the guidelines are based on studies that took the blood pressure in a standardized method. Now, so what have we found? I'm just going to briefly cover diastolic blood pressure, but this slide summarizes the major studies that showed us that a diastolic blood pressure goal of less than 90 does reduce cardiovascular events. It's possible that going lower is beneficial, but the best study we have for that is the HOT study, where we compared a goal of 80 diastolic or 85 diastolic versus 90 diastolic in about 19,000 patients, and we did not find a difference. Now, there may be a difference because there wasn't much difference in the average blood pressures in that study, and we learned how to do studies comparing blood pressure goals better after that. But I'm not sure anybody's going to do another study like that. Now, there is data that in diabetes that a goal of 80 or 85 diastolic might be better, but there's not much. And certainly in these studies, there were patients with diabetes and they benefited from less than 90. But certainly the 80 that is often recommended is not based on very strong evidence at this point. And the 80 benefit in diabetes in the HOT study was a post hoc hypothesis that was tested. So it really would need to be confirmed. So what about systolic blood pressure? Well, systolic blood pressure, these are really the major studies before the SPRINT trial that tested systolic blood pressure in a general hypertensive population. There are some other studies that have tested lower blood pressures, for example, the ACCORD blood pressure study in patients with diabetes. But we have these three major studies, SHEP, SYSTURE, and HIVET, that conclusively showed that getting below at least 150 is beneficial. And you can see that the achieved blood pressures for a couple of these were in the 140s. And so very nice reduction in cardiovascular events. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of other data for goals between that and 120. So these two studies done in Japan, the JADOS and VALOR studies, had goals of less than 140, and they were reasonably large in size. However, they had much fewer events than they expected. And so they did not show any definitive answer, but it was really underpowered, and we didn't get a definitive answer. I'm not sure now that a study will or should be done testing 140, even though it certainly many of us believe that 140 would be better than 150. And then the SPRINT trial. So we published SPRINT in 2015. It was a randomized control trial comparing a systolic blood pressure goal of less than 120 versus less than 140. And I'm sure you're fairly familiar with it. The primary outcome was major cardiovascular events. And in SPRINT, we found that intensive blood pressure substantially reduced 25% reduction in the overall cardiovascular outcome and a 27% reduction in all-cause or total mortality. And so this alone, the mortality benefit, would have been enough to stop the study. And so the study was stopped early because of these benefits. And you can see that the number needed to treat to prevent an event, and realize this is only over 3.2 years. The number needed to treat was 61 for the cardiovascular outcome and 90 for mortality. So a very effective intervention. And this was, I won't go into the details of it, but as you may know, this was a high-risk population, and they had to have either known cardiovascular disease or Framingham risk of at least 15%. And that's somewhat comparable to what the guidelines are using, the ACC-AHA guideline of 10%, for example. And so what we also looked at was all the subgroups. And I won't go into detail except to say that every major subgroup that we pre-identified and looked at had similar benefits. There was no heterogeneity. And so that was true for both the primary outcome and for all-cause mortality. And there's a lot of other data that's come out from SPRINT that you may be familiar with. This is just one that looked at the older population in particular, where we found an even greater absolute benefit for the lower blood pressure goal. And you can see that at least within our population, patients that were frail had as much or more benefit as those that were less frail. Now, we did exclude people that were in nursing homes, and so we can't necessarily know whether this applies to the extremely frail population, but at least within our population, those that were more frail did benefit. So when you're treating systolic blood pressure to a lower goal, how concerned should you be about how low the diastolic blood pressure goes? And so that's a question that has been looked at repeatedly over the years, and the so-called J-curve has been observed. And what the J-curve shows in these observational analyses of treated hypertensive patients is that the lower the diastolic blood pressure, the higher the risk over a certain period, over a certain range of blood pressure. And so we saw that in terms of epidemiology. Those that start out with the lowest diastolic blood pressures had higher risk. But what we found was that when we treated them to the systolic blood pressure goal of 120, they had the same benefit. This is for cardiovascular outcome. This is for all-cause death. And so it's a somewhat complicated slide, but it basically shows that for even a further reduction in diastolic blood pressure, when you treat the systolic blood pressure to the appropriate goal, then you still get the benefits, even in those with the lowest diastolic blood pressure. So at least my opinion is that we should not worry about the blood pressure, the diastolic blood pressure going too low, if you will. So what about diabetes? Well, in SPRINT, we excluded people with diabetes, but we did have a fairly sizable population with glucoses above 100. And some of those actually did have diabetes, but had just not been identified. And in that population, we saw just as much benefit as those who had normal glucoses at baseline. So this is important because in the ACCORD blood pressure trial with diabetes, we did not see an overall benefit. I'll come back to that in just a minute, but we do think there is benefit to lowering blood pressure to these goals in diabetes. So what we also saw was an improvement in the incidence of mild cognitive impairment. And so that was published more recently, and we did not see an overall improvement in dementia, but the risk reduction was the same. We think we just didn't have enough events to see the benefit. And so we did see this improvement, significant improvement, p-value of 0.01 in mild cognitive impairment, and the combined outcome of mild cognitive impairment and dementia. And so we're doing subsequent follow-up of these patients to see whether dementia is also benefited, and we believe it should be. Now, this illustrates what I was alluding to before. In the ACCORD trial, we saw that overall, ACCORD did not show a benefit of a significant benefit. We had about a 10 or 12% reduction in cardiovascular events. But when we looked at those who were in the standard glycemia group, that was an A1C goal of 7 to 8, as opposed to the intensive group, which was an A1C of less than 6. We did see a reduction, and that reduction was almost identical to what we saw in the SPRINT trial. And this was also looked at in this top part of this slide by Perkovich and Rogers in the editorial that accompanied the SPRINT publication in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they put SPRINT and ACCORD together and saw a significant benefit, and there was no heterogeneity between these two studies. So we do believe that people with diabetes are also getting benefit from lower blood pressure goals, even though we don't have the definitive trial evidence. There are other trials going on, including a large trial, the BP Road study, that is going on in diabetes in China. Now, here's a network meta-analysis that shows a comparison of reduction to various levels of blood pressure, 150 to 154, all the way down to 120 to 124. And a large meta-analysis of over 144,000 participants. And what they found was that each comparison, when compared to progressively higher levels, shows a significant lower rate of cardiovascular events. So a progressive benefit the lower the level. And here's 124, for example, versus greater than 160. So one of the things this points out is not only that getting down close to 120 is beneficial, but that any reduction in blood pressure is beneficial. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. And it's progressively better the lower we go, but even some benefit is conferred by reduction. So in the management of hypertension, any reduction in blood pressure is beneficial, as I pointed out, but specific blood pressure goals have been shown to offer the most protection. And so for diastolic blood pressure, the strongest evidence supports a goal of less than 90 millimeters of mercury. It's possible that going lower is beneficial, and I don't believe that if the diastolic pressure does go lower, that that's actually harmful. The United States American College of Cardiology and American Heart Association 2017 guideline and other guidelines do often recommend a goal of less than 80 millimeters mercury, but they point out that that is based on expert opinion. So we have very high level of evidence for less than 90, and then many would suggest trying to go lower. And again, if the diastolic does go lower when treating the systolic to the appropriate goal, I don't believe that is harmful. For systolic blood pressure, the best evidence is, sorry, I disappeared. The best evidence is from SPRINT, and we think there will be other trials that will come along testing the same question, but shows that less than 120, at least in a higher risk population, is beneficial. We believe that it would be for lower risk individuals, and most guidelines, many guidelines translate this to the 130 that you can confirm with meta-analyses. And so many guidelines do recommend 130 as a goal, but some do recommend 120. And for example, the kidney guidelines that we have just published, we do recommend considering 120 millimeter mercury goal, because that's what actually was done in the study, and the chronic kidney disease subgroup within SPRINT seemed to get the same benefit as those without kidney disease. As I have emphasized, all blood pressure goal recommendations assume a correct blood pressure measurement technique. And I think we need to be sure that we're changing our practice to accommodate that. And the best way to do that or the easiest way to do that, even though you can do it with a validated manometer that's done manually, but the best way to do it probably is with a fully automated machine where you can push the button, it automatically waits 5 minutes, takes the 3 readings, and it's important that there be no conversation or other things going on while those blood pressures are being taken. So I hope this has been of some use to you, and I think that we can certainly accomplish a great deal by treating the majority of hypertensive patients. Even getting down to less than 150 over 90 or 140 over 90 is going to be very beneficial. But the ideal would be getting below 130 or 120 systolic as a goal. Thank you.
Ray, you want to lead the discussion? I don't see
Dr.
any.
Mohan, thank you. Dr. Kushman, this is a fantastic presentation. You are very emphatic and very precise in your recommendation. What I gathered, the 2-3 points is that, as we are all saying, all three of us, that in prevention, something is better than nothing. That should be a clear message to all our delegates, that even if we cannot achieve the target of the best of the thing, at least we are not doing any harm by treating the patient to something, because all the relations are linear and continuous relation. There is no magic figure of any HbA1c, of any blood pressure or any LDL cholesterol. The lower the better, that should be the mantra. That should be the motto, and whatever we achieve. My question is, sir, people fight about the ESC and American guidelines on the threshold, but I think much more important is the lower value. Europeans are saying that you have to keep the systolic between 120 and 30 and diastolic between 70 and 80. If you go below, you reduce the medicine to jack up the blood pressure to some extent. But you Americans are saying, your guidelines are saying that go as low as possible, as long as the patient can tolerate it. So what is the fundamental rationale between, and do you feel sorry for the European patients because they're not getting the American benefits?
So I think that there's a lot of complexity to backing off of therapy. And, we didn't do the studies that way in the intensive group. Now, if the patient was symptomatic, which didn't happen that often, I didn't have time to go into this in SPRINT, but the overall adverse effects were really no different between the two groups. And there really weren't a lot of serious problems. We saw a few things that were 1 or 2% more common in the intensive group, but they were very manageable. So sometimes you saw bumps in creatinine, those kind of things. But I think for the asymptomatic patient, somebody who's doing well, then and I think the diastolic is the one that is the most difficult, because if you're backing off of therapy to keep the diastolic above some level like 70 or 60, then you may lose control of the systolic blood pressure, because many people are going to have wide pulse pressures. And so I think their recommendation is based on the epidemiology of the J curve that I alluded to, and there's no evidence from any intensive treatment studies that it's actually harmful if that diastolic goes lower. It's just that observational aspect. Now, for systolic blood pressure, I think that probably, if you're treating somebody to less than 120 or 130, if they go down to 100 or 110 and they're doing fine, then that's probably okay. We saw that a lot in the SPRINT trial. If the systolic is below 90, I would be more concerned, and even if the patient were asymptomatic, and would probably back off of some therapy then.
Actually, the J curve, I think J stands for John, because it's only backed up by John Cruikshank and nobody else, basically.
Well,
yes, Dr. Mohan, please.
Franz Messerly and some others have reported also, but yeah, but it certainly wasn't.
I had a question, Dr. Schmidt. So this, in older people, this is where this, the white pulse pressure thing starts coming in, because mild aortic incompetence due to age and so on. And so the pulse pressure starts increasing. And so as you bring down the systolic, the diastolic keeps going lower, 60, 56. So then we begin to worry. So if you're saying that it really doesn't matter, and that lower pulse, the diastolic pressure really doesn't matter, then we can keep going. But generally, physicians tend to back, oh my gosh, it's going so low. And so what's going to happen? Are we over treating? And so this balance between systolic and trying to achieve the systolic pressure gradient, because when you have the high pulse pressure, the systolic also goes up and the diastolic goes down. So when you're trying to bring down the systolic, we often run into this challenge. So in older people, so how would you respond?
The theory is there that the diastolic is important for perfusing the coronary arteries, but we've not seen in studies, nor have I seen clinically, that patients have more symptoms when you get the diastolic lower. And in the SPRINT trial in the intensive group, we had many people that had diastolics in the 40s and 50s, and certainly 60s. That lowest group had an average of 60 about. And so we just don't have the proof. Now, if it seemed that a patient, which I have not seen, but if it seems that a patient is having more symptoms when you lower the diastolic more, then perhaps you should back off. But at least within the ranges that we've studied so far, getting the systolic down, particularly in the 110 to 120 range, we did not see any increase of ischemic events or angina or other kind of symptoms. So I think that we need to be careful not to back off too much if we're achieving a decent systolic goal. And so if we're getting even, maybe you would accept something in the 120s, which guidelines often are recommending just less than 130. And if the diastolic is very low, then maybe you wouldn't push below 120. But we actually did that in SPRINT. So we think it may be beneficial, but certainly each patient has to be dealt with individually.
Actually, Dr. Mohan, just one comment on that, Dr. Mohan. To reassure my physicians, I sometimes tell, forget about hypertension. In an aortic regurgitation patient, the diastolic often per se is 30 or 40 or 20, even without any medicine. But is it doing any harm to the patient? It's a phenomenon because of the aortic regurgitation. So it really does not represent anything physiological. So I think that is also true, isn't it, Dr. Cushman?
Valid point.
Yeah, Dr. Mohan, you were going to say something.
So I was just saying that there's another comment in the box here saying that aggressive BP lowering is also shown to help in elderly with brain disease. So how important is this in the real world practice? So probably to prevent stroke, that's what I mean. So.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand your question. Is it helpful to prevent
Is it helpful in the elderly, and will it help to prevent strokes in the elderly and so on? So even in the elderly, can you push for these targets? That's the question.
Yeah, it appears that you can, and certainly we did exclude patients in SPRINT who had prior stroke because there were other studies going on, but it did not appear harmful in their suggestion of benefit. And we certainly know there are a lot of studies showing that chronic treatment of hypertension after stroke is extremely beneficial at preventing events. I didn't have time to go into the medications, but we did use in SPRINT, and most of these major studies use the standard classes that are generally recommended. And so I think that's important to keep in mind, is that this is using thiazide type diuretics, ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, calcium channel blockers as the mainstay of therapy, even though we could add other medications, and certainly often add beta blockers when the patient had a good indication for it.
One question is coming in different shapes and forms. The ACC guideline was heavily dependent on SPRINT result, and SPRINT result really differentiated between 120 and 140 of blood pressure. So how did you get the magic figure of 130? By what kind of extrapolation?
Yes. So I was not on those guidelines, I'll have to say. And so, but I don't think it's totally unreasonable. They primarily based the 130, I think, on two things. One was meta-analyses. So if they had just used SPRINT the way we did in the KDIGO guidelines, the kidney guidelines, then they might have said 120. But one was the meta-analysis that they did, which was a very good meta-analysis, clearly showed that below 130 was beneficial. And so not basing it just on the one study, even though SPRINT weighed heavily in that. I think the other reason, and they don't really admit this, is that they do know that most blood pressures are taken incorrectly and on average will overestimate blood pressure. So I think they were building in a little bit of a safety level here by saying 130. The blood pressures may really be 120 when you say 130. But I think we'll have to see how guidelines continue. If more and more we're doing blood pressures properly in the clinic, then I think it may be that we later on may recommend, down the road, as the kidney guidelines do, the 120. But again, those kidney guideline recommendations of 120 are strongly anchored on proper blood pressure measurement.
Thank you. I think we have got a very good discussion. Dr. Mohan, do you have anything to add?
No, nothing else. I think anyway, we do have some final things in the end, isn't it? So if there are any questions, we can still take it up in the final panel discussion. So let's move on in the interest of time.
So now it's my very glad. Thank you, Dr. Cushman, for a fantastic presentation and really clarifying some of our doubts in our mind, in our physician's mind. And now it's my very pleasant task to introduce Dr. K. Agarwal, who is one of my most favorite doctors and human beings in India. He's a fantastic person, and he has single-handedly taken the education, medical education through social media over last decades or so. He is an Indian physician and cardiologist present in the CMAO and president of the Heart Care Foundation of India. He was the past national president of Indian Medical Association, the largest body of doctors in the world. He has published many books on health, including Ayurveda, in which he combines ancient Vedic medicines with modern allopathy. There's a fantastic newer areas with 6 textbook chapters on echocardiography. He's one of the pioneers of streptokinase therapy. He was one of the pioneers of color Doppler technology of echocardiography in India. He is honored with fully deserving the BC Rai Award, the highest Indian award in the medical category way back 15 years ago. He's also a recipient of Vishwa Hindi Samman National Science Communication Award, FICC Healthcare Personality of the Year Award, Dr. D.S. Mongekar National IMA Award, and the Rajiv Gandhi Excellence Award. He's gold medalist and Limca Book of Record holder in CPR. And 10 years ago, he got the 3rd highest medal in India, the civilian honor, that is Padma Shri. So it's my pleasure to introduce Padma Shri Dr. Agarwal, please. On the most hot topic now worldwide and in India, of course, is the COVID vaccine. Dr. Agarwal, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. Thank you, Dr. Mohan. Thank you, William, to be here, and INTAS for supporting this event. I'm here to talk about the fear of the vaccine. Everybody knows the science, but I want to remove the fear. And that fear is based on practical anecdotal cases. So I'm going to show every possible fear and then try to take the fear out of that. So let me see my slides. Yes. So first of all, I'm going to talk about vaccines in India. That is going to be my basic topic. So when we talk about CIMAO, which is Confederation of Medical Association of Asia and Oceania, we brought out two mantras. In high-risk patients. Remember, I'm talking about susceptible, high-risk, comorbid patients. Definition is pro-inflammatory and pro-coagulative, which is nothing but cardiometabolic disorders. In those individuals, remember, reactogenic vaccines, which I'm going to define, can trigger transient thromboinflammation lasting for the first few days. The second thing is about the vaccines. All over the world, there has been one agreement: benefits outweigh the risk, which means it cannot be a community benefit or a community risk. It has to be individual benefit and the individual risk. That means every patient with comorbid situation has to be assessed individually, calculate the benefit versus the risk of COVID versus the risk of vaccine, and then reduce the risk and give the vaccine. These are the two mantras which we frame at Asia level.
Dr. Agarwal, can you go full screen, please?
So is death uncommon after COVID vaccine? Is death common or uncommon after COVID-19? Everybody is bothered about 1 death, 2 deaths, 3 deaths. Media takes over. But if you see the Washington Post report, 33 died in Norway, 502 people died in UK till February 28th, Germany 7 deaths, and in US 1,637 deaths till March 8th. Hong Kong, we have now 14 deaths which have occurred. So deaths are occurring, deaths are going to be there. But our question is, did my patient die of a vaccine? And if yes, was it preventable? That is what my talk is. The number of deaths have crossed 2,000 by the end of February 28th. That means another 1 month more deaths might have occurred. So death is a reality. That doesn't mean that now in sometimes back, 12 European countries and Thailand said, we are going to stop AstraZeneca vaccine. They did stop. Some of them started now with 63 plus age group because they said there is something wrong in women 63 minus age who are developing clots. So therefore, we are not going to give this vaccine. So we are seeing 3 patterns all across the world. We are seeing a pattern in Norway and Germany, where the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine were given. These were frail people. They died shortly after receiving the vaccine. Remember, shortly after receiving the vaccine, they all died. So there is one pattern of reactions which is seen in frail people. Definition of a frail people is you are not being able to get up once you sit on the chair without any support. These people are dying on the very first 24 hours due to something which we will explain. The second time of a pattern we are seeing is cardiovascular comorbidity death and inflammatory procedures. Inflammatory, you are getting different types of inflammations getting precipitated. And the third pattern we are seeing in Europe, where we are seeing a combination of low platelets with high fibrinogen. So there is a pattern we are seeing in Europe. We have also seen them few cases in India. And the pattern is there is formation of clots, which is evident by low platelets and high D dimer and high fibrinogen level, something like thrombocytopenic purpura or heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. I call them as vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia. So these are the three patterns we are seeing in this particular vaccine. All the vaccines which we are giving, these three patterns are seen. Now recall COVID. We were getting the same pattern. In COVID also, we were getting people dying suddenly because of oversympathetic overactivity, people developing MI, diabetes, cardiometabolic disorders having more inflammation, and people having pulmonary embolism. All these things, so same patterns were seen in COVID-19. The difference is in COVID-19, it is unpredictable. Here it is predictable. There it was long lasting. Here it is lasting only for few days. There it was preventable. Here it is preventable. Now let us redefine COVID-19. So COVID-19 is acute, manageable, immunogenic, thrombogenic, inflammatory, contagious, novel, viral disease at this moment in a pandemic phase. Now, when I take a vaccine, what is a vaccine? It's novel because this vaccine is coming for the first time. It's a COVID-19. It's a viral vaccine protein. So it is the same protein which is there in the virus. Because it is the same protein, it has the potential to cause acute thromboinflammatory, non-replicated, because the virus doesn't replicate, non-contagious viral protein. So therefore, this protein of a vaccine is likely to cause inflammation, thrombosis, and immune reactions. In addition to that, because this is a drug, it can also cause allergy. Now, my subsequent talk is going to be based on logic and anecdotal examples. I have given you the logic. Whatever the virus will cause, the virus protein introduced in my body in the form of a vaccine is going to cause the same, but in a predictable way, because the dose given in my muscle is small. So therefore, from pulmonary COVID, I am introducing the concept of a muscle COVID, which is predefined, which is under my control. Now, this is the virus everybody knows. If I give this virus, this is inactivated Covaxin or Sinopharm vaccine, but majority of the vaccines available, Johnson & Johnson, Oxford, Pfizer, and Moderna, we are using only the S part of the virus. Now, this is the virus, and you can see in this particular virus, you can see that there is an arrow which is showing the S gene of the RNA of the virus. Now, this S gene, I have cut it. See, I have cut this S gene from the previous one. I have taken this virus in the lab and I have cut the S gene. If I introduce this S gene in the body, it becomes Pfizer and Moderna virus. If I translate this S gene and genetically modify it in the lab and do a transcription of this, reverse transcription, I can convert this gene into a DNA gene. So now I have a double helical gene which is converted into a DNA. Now this DNA I have to introduce in the body. If I put it into a capsule, DNA capsid, it will become Zydus vaccine. If I introduce it in human adenovirus 26, it becomes Johnson & Johnson vaccine. If I introduce this DNA into a human adenovirus 5 and 26, it becomes Sputnik vaccine. And if I enter it into a chimpanzee adenovirus vaccine, it becomes a Oxford vaccine. So this vaccine now is a FDC, fixed dose combination drug, because I have two products here. One, a gene which is RNA converted into a DNA, And then I have a virus called external virus. So I have two stimuli in my body, which I am trying to enter in the body. Once this enters into my cell, the virus part comes out, the DNA parts goes to the nucleus, gets converted into mRNA, and then produces the spike protein and the spike. Now my body defense mechanism takes over. At the cell membrane, it takes over is toll-like receptors. Inside the cell membrane, not-like receptors. Outside the cell membrane, it initiates Th1 response and Th17 response. So outside my cell, it will produce Th1 response and Th17 response outside my cell. Now, if there is a dysregulation of Th1 or Th17 response or an LRP response, I may get different types of problems. Now here, this is what you see. These are the proteins which are coming outside the cell. So my cell will, all my body will try to destroy this cell. So there will be three mechanisms. Th1 response, which is a interferon response, will produce transient fever. It will produce muscle ache. It will produce fatigue. Apart from that, if the Th17 response comes in, it will precipitate underlying Th17 disorders like type 1 diabetes, pancreatic inflammation, thyroiditis, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis. So all those disorders which are dependent on T17 may get exacerbated by the T17 response. The Th1 response, if exaggerated, will cause high-grade fever because of tumor necrosis factor. And inside the cell, if there is a destruction or a suicide of the cell, it may produce IL-1 beta and IL-8 interleukins, which will cause very high-grade fever and inflammation in my body. Now, let's see what can happen in this particular situation, what can happen with that. So, first of all, let us see vaccine as a drug. Because vaccine is as a drug, it is a FDC, it is a dual drug. Now, RNA and DNA cannot cause anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis will only come because of either polyethylene glycol or polysorbate 80. Now, on the left, this doctor who died later on was confirmed she did not die of the vaccine. We have only two cases in India, 65-year-old male after first vaccine and 45-year male after second vaccine died of anaphylaxis, preventable. If you read the media reports, both could have been prevented if timely adrenaline was given to them. Now, so therefore, out of 6 crore people or 60 million people, media report says, anecdotal report says, I could trace only 2 deaths of anaphylaxis. Non-IgE mediated reactions can come after 6 hours. These are complement mediated reactions. You can prevent them by pre-medicating them with Montelukast and H1 blocker and H2 blocker, or you can treat them if they develop it. So all my patients who are allergic, I am pre-medicating them because they have a fear. To remove that fear, I am giving them a pre-medication. There is a risk of pre-medication. You can suppress type 1 hypersensitivity reaction, anaphylaxis. Therefore, if you treat them, continue treatment for 4 to 5 days. It's not SOS treatment. The first lady, angioneurotic edema. Second one, rash on the neck. Third, urticaria. Fourth, urticaria, all appearing after 6 hours to 48 hours. These are all real-time examples. When I was reading during the Journal of Medicine, I saw a BCG and a Montux-like reaction in one of the study. Then I made an appeal to all my shows, and if you have this type of a reaction, kindly contact me. And almost 15 to 20 people contacted me. And then I came to know type 4 hypersensitivity reaction in India is not uncommon. You can see this medical doctor who called me up, and he has a typical type 4 hypersensitivity reaction. It is not cellulitis, requires no treatment, and he had no reaction on the second dose. It happened only on the first dose. Another patient which developed a type 4 hypersensitivity reactions, and you can see 5 patients here who developed hypersensitivity reactions. This is type 4. All of them will recover over a period of time. Extreme right is an artifact. Now this is the left is a medical doctor who developed a BCG-like reaction. The second one developed a hypersensitivity reaction on the hand. The third one also developed a reaction, but he also has in very stress and developed stress-induced aphthous ulcers. This is another patient who developed a similar rash on the leg. This patient developed it on the ears. This developed on the back. This developed lasting 1 month in the leg. And this patient also lasted for 28 days, a urticarial rash. And here we also thought that probably are we missing thrombocytopenia, and thrombocytopenia was not there. Now, this is the patient who developed recurrent urticaria after the vaccine. Now, it is well-known phenomena. If you get urticaria, it may get suppressed and it may come back again without any further trigger. These are called recurrent urticaria. I have one patient who developed recurrent urticaria. Now, these are the patients who develop, this is the, after the first dose of vaccine, it persisted for 10 days, a reaction on the skin and on the eyes. Now, can we get lymphadenopathy? Yes. I saw a large number of patients developing ipsilateral, axillary, or submandible lymphadenopathy. And that means that cellular immunity is working. This is because the cells which have died, when I say NLRP reactions, the cells have died, they will be carried to the ipsilateral lymph nodes and a pain will come. On the left, I have a submental lymphadenopathy. And then 3 patients I saw infection in other parts of the body, like a systemic inflammation, 78-year-old female episcleritis, second patient left conjunctivitis, third patient left conjunctivitis. And why not? Why not? When the parent COVID causes eye inflammation, the vaccine will have to cause it. Transient, nothing to worry. Can I get neurological complications? I have 6 patients. 2 of them developed epilepsy, 1 developed TIA, 1 developed loss of consciousness, 1 developed the precipitation of neural pain, and 1 patient developed a blurred vision. Expected, nothing unexpected. If the parent virus causes, now all of them are preventable. Now all patients of mine who are having epilepsy, I tell them to take a tablet of frisium before the vaccine to prevent. All epilepsy have occurred within the first hour. So therefore, whenever there is an inflammatory over response, it can be a neuroinflammation getting precipitated. Now, can it precipitate underlying immunoinflammatory condition? As I said, yes. It can precipitate all diseases which come under T regulatory cell dysfunction or T17 dysfunction. This patient developed allergic reaction on the ear. This patient developed psoriasis on second day. This patient, my 3 patients developed worsening of rheumatoid arthritis. Now, this was when my first patient became rheumatoid precipitation, I started reading the literature, and then I found that T17, all T17 related disorders can get exacerbated by this vaccine. So these different numbers of patients I'm seeing. So this T17 inhibition can be prevented by vitamin D. So if you have a T17 disorder, if you have a T17 dysfunction, all disorders which are containing T17, I have started giving them high dose of a single dose of vitamin 1 hour before the vaccine to prevent IL-17 and T17 dysregulation. Bell's palsy, I have seen 3 cases. Chicken, this is the other one is a herpes zoster, first case. Second one is chicken pox, again related to T17. This is a case where I got severe herpes zoster. This is another patient of herpes zoster of the ear. So 3 patients I have got it. This is something you can't predict it, but early treatment, early diagnosis is important in this particular condition. One of my Thailand colleague in my Simao group, of whom I am the president, they noted an abdominal artery aneurysm rupture. How can this happen? So when I was reading about that abdominal artery rupture, then I came back and started studying about the plaque rupture physiology. And when I started talking about plaque rupture and unstable plaque, the whole pathogenesis is M1 versus M2 macrophages. M1 macrophages increases, causes thin cap fibroathyroma less than 0.65 millimeter. And if M2 macrophages are low, your fibroathema will be thinner. And if M1 macrophages are higher, you will have chances of plaque rupture. And then when I started studying about the vaccine and corona both increases M1 macrophages in the body. So therefore, wherever they will be, wherever in the body there will be vulnerable plaques, I call them as dimple in a pimple. Pimple is the vulnerable plaque. Dimple is the area where it can rupture. So therefore, COVID-19 and COVID vaccine can precipitate plaque rupture in susceptible individuals with underlying silent blockages with vulnerable plaques, with a phenomena called dimple in a pimple. So this is how I started looking at. This is one of my patients who developed loss of smell and taste after vaccine. This is a medical doctor. I'm still following whether it is a reinfection, but he says my RT-PCR is negative. These are 2 of my patients who developed severe thyroiditis because of COVID, but both of them came to me for a vaccination. And if they would have gone for a vaccination, they would have gone into a thyroid storm. So therefore, you also, when you give a consultation, whether you can go for a vaccine or not, make sure you are not missing. Both the thyroid scan typically shows absence of thyroid, which is a severe thyroiditis with negative thyroid antibodies. Large number of patients are developing heart attack after the COVID-19. All deaths in India, Hong Kong, wherever you say, they says underlying disease was cardiometabolic disorder. And all my patients, all those who have died of vaccine had underlying, this person had very severe sleep apnea, cardiac metabolic disorders. So all patients with cardiac metabolic disorders may develop, and if they have susceptible, if they have inside underlying heart blockages with vulnerable plaques, it can rupture. So remember, it is not in a healthy person. So it has to, all those people who are not following all the previous 3 lectures, their cholesterol is high, their blood pressure is high, their diabetes is uncontrolled. And here I got a marker called C-reactive protein. As a cardiologist, we know a CRP of less than 1 is low risk, less than 0.65 is 0 risk, between 1 to 3 is moderate risk, between 3 and 10 is high risk. After 10 is a gross inflammation. So those people who have low-grade systemic inflammation with underlying metabolic syndrome or a metabolic disorders, their chances of having a vulnerable plaques are high. Therefore, in such cases, I'm suggesting them to take aspirin, statin, and colchicine combination before you take the vaccine. Hong Kong, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, all people died of underlying heart disease. Now, this is sympathetic overactivity. I have 1 patient, I have 60 patients who developed accelerated hypertension. 2 patients who developed AF, 1 who developed a VT. Now, these are the people who will die if they are frail. If you are frail, you will develop sympathetic overactivity and die. Therefore, in frail people, give them vaccine under cover of a beta blocker. Now, this will interest Dr. Mohan. I have 6 patients whose diabetes worsened after the vaccine. And I presume this is also a type of a T17 dysregulation occurring. All 7, these are the 6 patients whose diabetes worsened on record, which was transient, became all right. Postprandial hypotension as an autonomic dysfunction, I have seen 1 patient with that. And then we come back now to the next part is clots. 37 patients have been detected with clots, subarachnoid hemorrhage with low platelet count, 1 case reported in India. These are my patients showing the different types of thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. My definition of this is that you have to have low platelet. Along with that, you must demonstrate purpura and you must demonstrate post-vaccine. And these are the patients, they must have high D dimer. So this is something like HIT, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, or DIC, or TTP, or HUS, hemolytic uremic syndrome, or thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. I call them as VIT, vaccine-induced thrombocytopenia. Now, what happens in these cases is you will develop thrombocytopenia after day 4. So all those patients who develop thrombocytopenia after day 4, minimum 30% fall in platelets with clinical evidence of thrombosis somewhere with other cause ruled out. This is classical clots we are seeing in the Europe, and I have seen 4 or 5 patients in India. I've seen 1 patient similarly in post-tibial thrombosis. And the last thing which we are seeing is systemic inflammation. Like a multi-system inflammatory disease, we are seeing systemic inflammation in patients who have a combination of a COVID and vaccine. That means COVID plus vaccine or COVID after vaccine. So COVID before vaccine or COVID after vaccine, we are seeing an exaggerated Th1 response, very high fever, very high CRP, lungs spared, lasting for 3 to 4 days. And some of them will develop clots after some time. So these are systemic inflammation 3 cases. And these are the various types of cases. I am just giving them numbers. These are all case histories of different types of patients I have seen. I have seen 1 patient with a very high platelet, 1 patient with vasculitis. Now, these are the examples which we are seeing. I'm not going into detail. Now I am studying on a combination of vaccine. I have around 40 patients with me. I'm still studying their literature, that combination of a vaccine and COVID, because now we are seeing every day patients developing COVID after first vaccine. At least I have a data of 30, 40 patients who have developed COVID after they have received the first vaccine. I have 10 patients who have developed COVID after the second vaccine. I'm still trying to make my mind to find out the markers for detection. This is one marker which everybody should remember. This belongs to Dr. Mohan's category, his field, that if you have this acanthosis nigricans, take it for granted you are pro-inflammatory, make it for granted you are pro-thrombotic, and if you are pro-inflammatory and pro-thrombotic, your CRP will be more than 0.65, often more than 1, often more than 2. These are the patients who will show high degree of inflammation and clots, whether arterial or venous. Arterial means clot, the plaque rupture because of macrophage, or they will develop a venous clot because of high fibrinogen level in the body. And so therefore I say all my patients with COVID-19, I ask them, do you have a microalbumin in the urine? Do you have a CRP of more than 1? Do you walk in 6-minute walk test less than 200 meters? So if my patients have a microalbumin positive, that means the chances of having underlying vulnerable plaque may be higher. If your CRP is more than 1, chances of underlying inflammation are very high. And with that, if your LDL is also there, and if your 6-minute walk test carries less than 200 meters, so I say, for me, in an individual case with these 2 or 3 parameters, if a person has, he needs evaluation. We need to weigh the risk of benefit versus the risk. The risk of COVID is much higher in these 3 cases than with vaccine. Therefore, I will give them a vaccine under cover of colchicine to cover NLRP pathway, statin to cover for the risk of vulnerable plaque getting rupturing, and aspirin to stop any vulnerable plaque rupturing. And aspirin will also stop any platelet aggregation, and therefore I will be able to prevent clots in particular cases. Thank you very much. These are all my personal cases which I have seen, except for few slides. All are a personal experience. I can't give them the statistics because these are all anecdotal examples. I have done by now, this is my 2082nd seminar. So in every seminar, people approach me and they want to share with their reports. So I've collected this data because people come to my show and say, I have developed this, I have developed this, I have developed this. So I note down the history and collect the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Agarwal. I think, I'm amazed that so much of data you have been able to collect in such a short time. I don't know that anyone has collected so much data from one single individual collecting so much. It's amazing how people have responded to watching all those messages coming in. Do we have any questions? Let me see.
I think, Dr. Mohan, because of lack of time, we have got only 20 minutes left. We go to the next session, which is again the how we are coping in COVID situation, so that we can pick up the questions over there.
Okay, let's do that.
So just one
Dr. Kushman, please join with us.
Yes. I will be leaving 5 minutes to 7 because I have a back-to-back 7 o'clock show.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
So I'm here with you, but at 5 minutes to 7, I will leave.
Okay.
So to
Dr.
begin,
you want to lead the discussion now?
Okay. Thank you. I have got 2 very quick questions which are coming after. It is like a classroom teaching. Really, it's now. It will take some time to digest the whole the information we got. 2 quick questions which came already. One is people with history of anaphylaxis. What is your recommendation?
Answer is very clear. Take these eye drops. All the eye drops are available in the market. Every eye drop contains polysorbate 80. Okay, in this computer era, all of us are using these eye drops because we are working on the computer again and again. If you are using these eye drops and you don't develop an allergy, you are not going to develop anaphylaxis because this contains polysorbate 80. Indian vaccines contains polysorbate 80. Western vaccines contains polyethylene glycol. And polyethylene glycol, you can drink it like a laxative. And if you don't get any reaction, you are fine.
Oh, that's fantastic. So even with a clear history of anaphylaxis, if this eye drop is safe, then
you have to be anaphylactic to polysorbate 80, not to anything else.
Okay, excellent.
In penicillin, anaphylaxis has nothing to do with COVID anaphylaxis. COVID anaphylaxis is only due to polysorbate 80. This is a substance used in most of the drugs. You have taken pneumonia vaccine that contains polysorbate. So you just check for a polysorbate.
That's great.
Simple.
That's great. That's great. And my second quick question is that many people are. This is a very, very unfortunate for on the part of our vaccine producer. If you are on blood thinner, please ask your doctor or stop the blood thinner. What is this nonsense?
So there is a KK's law. Whatever people say, just reverse it. You will be true.
I know, because this, even came up from the manufacturers. And
yes, that's what I'm saying.
as a doctor, I say double your dose instead of stopping.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
When this
Fantastic.
came as headline news before
Yes.
the vaccine, saying that everybody on blood thinner should not
Yes.
take it, people with
Yes.
comorbidity should not take it, people with diabetes should not take it. Then I said, then who should take it? I mean,
Who
a
should take
healthy
it?
20-year-old person who has no
So
risk of
my
dying due to COVID, he
my
should take it.
answer is, I'll
Everyone else should
say
not. Just confuse
take
the
your
daylights out of everyone.
painkiller, take your aspirin and a platelet inhibitor 1 hour before the vaccine. That's what I tell my people, because you have to prevent remember, 37% of our population is procoagulative. Metabolic syndrome is procoagulative. Metabolic syndrome, which comes 5 years before the diabetes, is procoagulative. Now, these are the people who have to be on aspirin before the vaccine. And I've shown, I have not, because of the time, I have not shown the data. How many cases, because I'm following them with D-dimer, all patients with a high CRP, their D-dimer is increasing on day 2. You can see sequential rise in D-dimer. Now, if they are susceptible, they will develop a clot. Otherwise, it will be a transient hypercoagulable state. They will become all right. So all these deaths which are occurring are preventable if you pick up the signals.
So, Dr. Agarwal, I had one question for you. See, the CRP less than 1, I mean, the theoretical basis for that, I have no doubt at all that the lower the CRP, the better, less than 0.65, less than 1. About that, I have no doubt. But it's also true that in the Asian Indian phenotype, a high CRP is one of the factors which, if you just routinely scan the population, you will find 30-40% of them having a CRP between 3 and 10, because first of all, we have more proneness to atherosclerosis, to diabetes, to metabolic syndrome, chronic inflammation. Plus, we have so much of subclinical inflammation itself in our subclinical infection, subclinical inflammation. And therefore, it's very difficult to find people with a normal CRP in our population.
I'll get you the
If you're
answer.
insisting that it should come down below 1 before you take a vaccine,
No,
rolling out a national program, isn't that very difficult?
No, it's not. It is impossible. So what we are doing, a subclinical infection, CRP will be more than 10.
Yeah.
I'm talking about subacute subclinical inflammation.
Inflammation. Okay.
In a subclinical inflammation, the CRP will be between 1 and 10. Okay. Now, if you have a subclinical inflammation and fatty liver, I have no issue for the vaccine. If you have subclinical inflammation and eye problem, I have no issue. If you have a subclinical inflammation and skin psoriasis or any eczema, I have no issue. Because I know there are 5 areas in my body where low-grade systemic inflammation happens. That's eye, that's GI, that's liver, that's blood, and that's heart. I am only interested in preventing subclinical inflammation to develop them into a clot or a susceptible person with vulnerable plaque. There, I am interested in them to stop precipitation of an MI. So what we say is, in susceptible, high-risk, comorbid patients, if you have 2 of the 3, either you have a microalbumin positive, which indicates you have retinopathy, nephropathy, you have underlying coronary artery disease, or you have a classical metabolic syndrome with acanthosis nigricans, he is likely to develop the clots, or your walk distance is less than 200 meters, which means you probably have an angina, or you are a known angina. That's what you do. Now, how did I get interest into this subject is 2020 October edition of Up to Date have included colchicine as the drug of choice to be added in all patients with CAD. Something like hydroxychloroquine came for diabetes under DCGI. Now, colchicine has come back as a drug of choice for all patients with underlying blockages. Then I started reading about colchicine and I came to know mechanism of action. So when you read about colchicine, it talks about NF nuclear factor kappa B pathway, which is a pathway inside the nucleus, which is like a JAK inhibitor pathways, which stops production of all the interleukins in the body. So therefore, I started working on Kalmec, Charaita, Kutki, and colchicine in various patients with CRP. Within 2 weeks, your CRP will come back to normal if it is 7 or 8. Just try it out in your diabetic patients. Just try it out, colchicine, and you will find their CRP becomes normal within 2 weeks' time. Within 2 weeks' time. So what I've started giving my patients is, if you're going for a vaccine, take aspirin plus colchicine plus statin, cover it for a week or two, take out your vaccine, and after that, talk to your doctor, do I need to continue it or not? And if I see if your CRP is 7, and if you start your colchicine, and if it becomes 6, so I know it is not going to increase. Once you show a downward pattern of CRP, I said go ahead with the vaccine, because CRP will double. CRP can go up to maximum 4 times after the vaccine. That's a standard literature of a reactogenic vaccine. So if it is 7, it can become 28. And that 28 CRP can rupture my plaque. So therefore, what I am doing is giving them colchicine, 0.5 milligrams, cheapest drug in the market, old drug. There is no commercials involved anywhere. This is the cheapest medicine available in the country. And this will cause fall in, and therefore I'm asking Dr. Mohan is to work with you on this, that if we can give this colchicine with, what I am now finding is when I'm giving colchicine and statin, their dose is reducing. When I'm giving colchicine and anti-diabetic, their anti-diabetic drugs are reducing. When I'm giving colchicine with anti-hypertensive drugs, their dose is reducing, because I'm taking the root cause is inflammation. And if I take away the root cause inflammation, which is nuclear factor kappa B pathway, which is NLRP pathway, which reduces M1 macrophages and increases the M2 macrophages, reduces IL-1 beta and reduces IL-8, cheap medicine, why don't try it? And in the meantime, try to find out the cause and treat the cause. It will not take care of, there are 2 types of inflammation in CAD and diabetes. One is inflammation because of white adipose cells. And there is another one that is a free radical induced injury. Now, colchicine has nothing to do with free radical induced injury, because free radical induced injury will be apoptosis, which will be different, but it will definitely take care of pyroptosis, which I call them as suicidal bombers inside the cell in the form of a NLRP inflammation.
Now, sir, if we change a little bit of our discussion to Dr. Cushman, what is, sir, your experience over the last 1 year in US of the changing pattern of patients' behavior in the preventive medicine and preventive cardiology with the COVID era? How are they coping and how you are coping? Have you changed your strategy or follow-up or treatment? Is there anything grossly changed in your practice, sir?
Yes, I think the main thing is that we've many patients we've not been bringing into clinic, or they're not willing to come into clinic. Now that's changing now that we have 100 million people vaccinated. But so basically, we've markedly increased telehealth. And for many, that's actually just telephone, but also video visits are done within the VA system, for example. Most of our primary care clinics nationally, we're not seeing patients virtually at all, and doing everything, by video or telephone visits. And I think we've learned a lot from that too. And in hypertension, we can actually manage many of our patients for a much longer period of time through if we're making sure they're doing their home blood pressures properly, for example. And you can't assume that many patients don't do them properly, but if there are a number of good videos on how to do home blood pressures, and so we try to steer our patients toward that. And then we often will manage the hypertension, even titration of medications over the phone. Eventually, I'd like to see them back in clinic and confirm what's going on. Today, we are the majority of our visits actually are in person. So we have, I think, close to 20% of the U.S. population has been vaccinated, and within our medical systems, an even higher percent of our patients have. I do think there were a lot of patients that did not get adequate care during COVID, and they chose not to go in for their visits, and I think we're not being managed adequately.
Dr. Mohan, Dr. Kushman hit a very important point that we are experiencing that we can manage these patients without seeing them physically for at least some time. So in your experience, with your huge database, do you think any increased complication or hospitalization in these patients because of teleconsultation?
So it cuts both ways. So first of all, let's go back to say a year ago when we had the lockdown. So people reacted in two completely different ways. The first was there was a fear that people won't come into the clinic, and therefore, and also they can't go out and walk, they can't follow a proper diet, and then of course the stress and the depression and everything. And so there were big predictions that the A1Cs would hit the ceiling, and to be fair, they did happen to many of the patients, particularly those from the little lower socioeconomic group and those who are not of that well-educated class. They kind of gave up and they said, oh, this is the end, and that kind of a thing. But then very interestingly, we also published a study where we looked at our own patients from different parts of India. And we asked them about, and we saw when was their A1C done. And during this period, many of them had checked their A1Cs. And we also took detailed histories about diet, exercise, and so on. Exercise was a problem unless they had a terrace or something where they could go in the flats where they could walk, and there was some closed gated communities. But otherwise, exercise did take up. But diet, very surprisingly, people said, well, I can't, and every time they were reading about comorbidity and people with diabetes, uncontrolled, doing badly. So they actually turned it around, and I found that A1Cs actually came down during this. And we published this. It was the first report to show that A1Cs actually came down during all these troubled periods, simply because of the fear that, diabetes can kill me, and so I have to be careful. So that was the other side of the coin. Of course, we published subsequent papers on this and from my own clinic. But if you take the population-based studies that we did, many did badly because they didn't go out and get drugs, and there was a little bit of supply problems. And so it cut both ways. Now, talking about the telemedicine thing, again, we published a paper there. And initially telemedicine, nobody was happy with it. People only like face-to-face. But when they realized that they cannot get a face-to-face consultation, more and more people started accepting it. And out of those who actually undertook the telemedicine, when we asked them, will you suppose this is the future and you're going to continue this? 50% said, well, it seems to be working. And so they were older people and they had to depend on somebody to take them to the clinic. Now we were going home and collecting the blood and then having a teleconsultation. They said we don't have to wait in the clinics. And so 50% of them said, this is fine. But the other 50% said, no, we missed the doctor's touch. We missed the doctor. Having a face-to-face consultation is very different from, even if there's a video consultation, it's very different. It's impersonal. And we don't want this. It's only till the epidemic. After that, no. And the moment we opened up our clinics, they all came back. And so we didn't lose any patients because they were all willing to wait and then come back. So I think people still want that touch and feel of the doctor and somebody patting them on the back and checking the blood pressure themselves, and rather than sending a technician out to the home and checking and so on. There's a lot of difference. But having said that, there is a possibility now that telemedicine has been legalized that perhaps the number of visits in a year, suppose they're coming 4 times in a year, maybe twice they can come for face-to-face and twice we can have a telemedicine. So this has kind of opened up new opportunities which earlier were not there.
So both are going to stay, and both will have a complementary effect to each, and that we learned in a under compulsion. But I think that's a good thing forward. Looking forward, do you have any special
this program that we are doing? We would never have thought a year ago, 2 years ago, we would have to have an Crossconnect where we had all been taken off to some city and we would have stayed there and then stayed in a hotel. And Dr. Kushman would have taken a couple of flights or 3 flights to come to India, spend 3 days in that. Whereas here he is, sitting in his home and doing this. So this is something which we learned, that this is a very efficient way of doing it. I mean, why should we travel for meetings and so on? So I think this has also come to stay, unfortunately or fortunately.
No, and at least 3 times more delegates are participating in this program than in a physical program. So we are reaching out.
Dr. Agarwal has already gone off to address his next
another
we would never have done that if we were in E-Connect in some city,
From my experience as a cardiologist, I can say that definitely during those time, we were a bit on the back foot for invasive cardiology, particularly primary angioplasty took a serious hit. And we had now after effect of that, more people are coming with heart failure. More people are coming with post-infarct complications with blocked arteries, which are not open in proper time. So those fears of hospitalization were there, which are now gradually, now we are also coping more nicely to how to streamline the patients when they're coming to the emergency.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because, during that period, what was the joke? That, because of this lockdown and because we can't think, heart attacks have come down. And not seeing the doctors actually help. There's a kind of thing going around that all this is unnecessary, and here we are, less heart attack, less deaths, less this, less that, and so on. Of course, a lot of stress coming down, pollution people are not exposed to, travel, stress, depression, anxiety, all that came down when people are sitting at home, working from home. So that was not factored in. But now I'm glad that we have lost a few patients due to diabetic foot. They didn't come. We kept telling them, they showed pictures, WhatsApp. And they said, there's an emergency. Please come. No, we'll get COVID. You may get COVID, but you won't lose your leg because of gangrene, And then we kind of told them, and one person actually lost. He never came. Another person ended in a below-knee amputation. And if only they had come a week earlier, we could have saved them.
Dr. Kushman, what is your experience?
I want to ask Kushman something. So this, point I made about the heart attacks coming down in diabetic people in the high income countries. Now, are you seeing that the gap between those with diabetes and without diabetes is kind of narrowing now? And the people with diabetes getting similar results to those without diabetes, thanks to better control and.
Yeah, I don't know the data on that. I'm sorry, okay. But I would assume that may be the case, but certainly the natural history of atherosclerosis has changed dramatically in the United States. And so I would assume that would be the case in diabetes as well.
Dr. Mohan, do you change the types of medicines used for diabetes, particularly the newer ones, for COVID situation or COVID affected patients? Is there any bearing on those?
So if there's very clear guidelines now. So if the COVID is mild, and it is mild, as you know, in the majority of cases, there's no need to change anything. It's like, for a cataract surgery, will you go and change everything, put them on insulin? It's too much of an overkill to do that. So if the diabetes is well controlled and the COVID is mild, don't do anything, just continue as such. But if the patient requires hospitalization for COVID and the COVID is severe, insulin is definitely indicated because it's an anti-inflammatory, has anti-inflammatory properties apart from, apart from glucose control. Plus, there are drugs like the SGLT2s and so on, which are very powerful, but they also produce dehydration, volume depletion, and so many other things. So temporarily stopping those may be a good idea. There was some data showing that those who are on metformin did better, but that may be because the milder cases were on metformin. To start with, it could be a referral bias of that. DPP-4 inhibitors are supposed to be very safe during this and probably have an edge because they do have some benefits. There are some reports on that. Regarding sulfonylureas and insulin, well, you just use them for control of diabetes as you do them. So the drug, and probably the glitazones anyway we would not use because of fluid overload and so on. So except for the glitazones and the SGLT2s, although there was a study on dapagliflozin being done in the US in acute COVID to see whether there's any benefit. I'm not aware if the study has been published or not, but there was a study actually being done using SGLT2s. So in mild cases, just leave them alone and continue with whatever you're doing. But in severe cases, insulin always.
Dr. Kushman, what is your take on use of RAS blockade, ACE inhibitor, ARB in hypertension in COVID era?
Yeah, so certainly there's been a lot of interest in that since the very beginning, since the COVID attaches to the ACE2, and ACE inhibitors and ARBs can actually have different effects. But the data I'm aware of seems to suggest that that there's no benefit or harm from it, and therefore they should be continued. And actually, there may be some harm by stopping them in terms of increased cardiovascular events.
If I be more specific, you recommend to continue it and not stop it. But if it is a newly diagnosed hypertensive, will you by preference start with a RAS blockade in the COVID era, or will you wait for the COVID era to go off?
At this point, I'm not doing anything different in terms of that. You know, I'm not aware of any data. Maybe you all have seen some, but you know, at this point, I'll just treat them similar to what I usually would. And I actually use a lot more thiazide type diuretics as initial therapy in many people.
So, Dr. Dhiren, how much time do we have? I think we have finished our time, Dr. Mohan.
Yeah. I'll ask sir 1-2 question and then we can finish it off. We have a lot of questions from the audience, and currently we have more than 6,000 viewers present. So
really?
they have a lot of questions, and I really want to get in 1 or 2 questions so we can squeeze in there.
Please go ahead.
One particular question that I have for Dr. William Cushman and Dr. Ray sir, that you talked about the hypertension guidelines, and the first thing you mentioned is the blood pressure measurement and how it is important. But when we talk about India, it is very difficult in Indian scenario particularly to get the right blood pressure, and I'm sure Dr. Ray would agree with me that in Indian setup where there's a lot of burden of patient, many of the clinicians, they are not measuring the blood pressure right. When we are saying that you need to take at least 2-3 readings, many of the doctor might not be doing that. So how you see this challenge in US, and I would like to take Dr. Ray's opinion as well for India.
You can't keep a Indian not speaking for 5 minutes. So that is the first criteria which fails miserably. A patient not talking for 5 minutes is something impossible. So, apart from joke, Dr. Cushman, it's a real problem we face in busy clinics. The criteria look a bit artificial to us. So we try to do our best, but we really do not know how to extrapolate our data with the ideal data. I mean, if I get 130 in a busy clinic, whether it translates to 120 in an ideal setup or 125, we do not know. So we are really a bit at a loss. Do you have any suggestion for that?
Yeah, so I think that setting up the practice or system where one patient can be getting their blood pressure done while you're doing something with another patient. The data does suggest that it doesn't matter whether somebody is in the room or not. And there was a lot of controversy about that, whether you had to be out of the room and leave the patient alone. But I think the majority of studies show that as long as you're not interacting and talking with the patient, so you can be doing something else, the staff they can be with another patient, interviewing the patient. And if it's even in a room with other people, as long as nobody's interacting and talking with the patient, then they can be getting their blood pressures done. So I think just setting up the system a little bit differently, because in many settings, the patient's sitting there and somebody puts the blood pressure cuff on. If it's an automated machine, they push the button and then they start interviewing the patient. And that's what we can't have happen, because that's going to give you a totally false blood pressure level. So if you're doing something else on a computer or doing something with another patient, there are plenty of patients there, usually, to do something with another patient while one patient is being left alone for 8 minutes.
So, Dr. Dhiren, is really no easy answer for that. And it's such a labile parameter. As Dr. Cushman say, you allow other person. If it is a fine young nurse goes to see your blood pressure, pretty nurse, your blood pressure will shot up. And instead of, if I go there, he will be so bored that his blood pressure will go down. So it is so variable a parameter. I think we have to accept somewhere in between that, okay, this is an average.
It may go up again because the nurse didn't take the pressure. So. disappointed.
What I mean is it's so variable, I think, depends on so many things in your environment. It is very difficult to standardize except in research setup, but we have to accept somewhere. What is your second question, Dr. Dhiren? You said you have got a couple of burning issues.
So the last question I would ask, and anybody can pitch in for this question, that how is the pandemic shaping the future for present generation who are almost seated for throughout the day? They're doing work from home. They're not actively enough. So what future holds for whether the cardiometabolic disorders that we talk today, whether they will go up, or people will become more conscious because of COVID and they will start following all the dietary health and practices, and COVID will go down or cardiometabolic disorder will go down. So what is your take on this?
So I can go first. Each one of us can give. So I think it all depends on the individual. In fact, I have increased my exercise during this time. For 1 year, I work from home. As of last week, after I've taken my second shot of the vaccination, I started going back to work. But I don't think my exercise or my diet changed during this 1 year. If anything, it was more. Earlier, I used to do it on a treadmill because you're not allowed to go out in the street. The police were kind of walking around and shooing away people. But once that kind of phase got over, I've started wear a mask and then I go for my walk. And if anything, I have increased. I've added an Apple Watch, which tells me, to close my 3 rings every day. And so I don't think for the last 6 months, there you are. So for the last 6 months, not even 1 day I have not been without closing the ring. And I don't think it's that regular earlier. It was regular, but not that regular. So I think it all depends on people. And a lot of people have become more conscious during this time, saying that I better look after my health, I better build my immunity, I better get to bed in time, because we've been showing these videos. If you don't sleep, your immunity goes down. Eat a lot of fruits and vegetables to build up your immunity. So people have done that. But then there are others, their lifestyle is so crazy anyway, and they just don't care. Then they find this is one more excuse. Otherwise, they'd have given some other excuse if this wasn't there. So it all depends on the individual, I feel. And even many of my patients have done, as I said, extremely well. Some of them, their A1Cs have come down to levels I've never seen. So I used to say, COVID is a much better teacher than I am.
What I found among my young patients and my relatives and friends, that of long hours of online work and consultation had basically 3 effects. One is a kind of depression and boredom. That is number 1. Number 2 is some eye problem are having with focusing. And thirdly, the problem with these typing things, with the wrist and other things. So these 3 I have identified as a necessary nuisance of this thing. But otherwise, I myself has lost 10 kg weight over the last 1 year. Because, after this meeting, in other years, we would have a cocktail dinner. Exactly. And I would have gorged myself. Today, I've got nothing, my home usual dinner. So that makes an instantaneous difference between the lifestyle, because it is our daily practice to go for seminars and give talks. What is your experience, Dr. Cushman, on this particular issue? Perhaps the last talk or last say.
So personally, I like you, Dr. Mohan, I have actually increased my exercise. I believe that on average, at least in America, many people did gain weight from being, homebound, if you will, and stuck on computers and what have you. So I think there was more of that. But I found that I took more advantage of going out for walks, as you did, Dr. Mohan. So I think it varies, but I think people have paid attention to their diet, as you mentioned. In my patient population, I haven't detected that there's been a lot of loss of blood pressure control amongst patients. But again, we're doing a lot more, even more frequent telephone visits. Not just me, but our pharmacists are. They're doing phone visits or video visits. And I do think that in the future, this has set a pattern for us that, as you mentioned, that we'll do more of that in the future, and it'll be really beneficial to our patients. We did see one problem with patients not wanting to come in for lab to be done. And our particular medical center actually set a tent up outside in the parking lot where patients could just drive through and get lab. And that made a big difference. But I don't know that was very widely done. I didn't get the impression that it was.
Great.
Thank you so much, sir. And I must say, it was indeed a very insightful scientific meeting. Should we close today's session, sir?
Absolutely.
Okay. So thank you so much. I must mention my deep sense of appreciation for our course directors, Dr. Soumitra Ray sir and Dr. V. Mohan sir, for formulating and conducting this invigorating scientific program. I would also like to express our sincere thanks to all the faculty members, Dr. William Kusman sir and Dr. K.K. Agarwal sir, for their contribution and expert insight. And finally, a big thank you to all the clinicians, more than 6,000 clinicians who are watching us live, for sparing your valuable time. If you like this program, do let us know. You can write your comment in the comment box, what you liked and what you not liked. My sincere thanks to all the members of Crossconnect organizing team who have worked so hard to make this program successful. And I would also like to thank our studio partners for their contribution and support. With this, I wish and hope for a brighter and healthier future for all of us. I would like to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you and good night.
And Dr. Kushman, enjoy your breakfast. We shall enjoy our supper.
Yes.
I may skip it.
Goodbye. Goodbye, sir.
Thank you. Great to be with you.